Good morning and welcome along to this long-term plan workshop, which is also being live streamed. Just once again, the workshop's being run in accordance with the principles of open and transparent decision making. It's accepted that many of us will have our own views on quite a few matters, and in many cases we might have already had views on what the right answer to an issue is, but we need to still maintain an open mind. You're not required to approach every decision as though you've given it no prior thought or don't have any existing knowledge or an opinion, but keeping that open mind is paramount. So just if we keep that in mind, and for those joining on the live stream, councillors are expressing opinions or asking questions, but no decisions are being made, and what happens from today is it helps formulate the documents that will come forward to council for us to approve to go out for consultation. And once we've done the consultation, that's when the decisions are made. So we're covering off a variety of topics today. We've got some people from Environment Southland who are joining us this afternoon. We're covering off the region and the environment. And Rhiannon, if you'd like to kick us off. Oh, sorry, just before we start, we do have an apology for lateness from His Worship the Mayor. Welcome, Councillor Soper. Just a reminder that we're live streaming. That's the only apology I have. Somebody like to move that we received.
An apology from Mayor Clark.
That's what, sorry. Apology for lateness from Mayor Clark.
No, he's not here. He's in Wellington in business. So somebody.
I think. Well, he thought he might be here later on this morning.
Mayor Clark?
Yeah.
He emailed that he would be joining in a bit, but...
No, he's in work.
Okay.
Well, my understanding is for the next 2 days he's in Wellington.
Well, in that case, we'll receive a full
Anyway,
apology. Evelyn, seconded. Leslie, thank you. This time, Rhiannon.
Kia ora, councillors. So yes, as Darren says, today's discussion is about a range of environmental issues, and from today's workshop that will help inform the development of asset and activity plans and give us some direction on some of those key environmental issues. On the agenda, we've got the regional spatial strategy and the district plan review. So Jonathan's going to be speaking to that, updating you on those two big pieces of work which intersect and obviously are affected by the RMA reform. And then we've got an update on climate change and the work of the Regional Climate Change Working Group, which has just commenced, steered by Environment Southland and Te Marama. Then Environment Southland will be joining after lunch. So those of you watching the live stream, there will be a short pause while the councillors refresh themselves, and then after lunch we will discuss the coastal plan, latest information on New River estuary contaminants, and the regional public transport plan. And that will be the end of the public workshop. So a reminder of council's strategic priorities and community outcomes in the area of the environment. The community outcome that's been confirmed is a healthy, resilient environment where the city is well positioned to navigate climate change. So that is the aim for the long-term plan that we are in the process of developing, that will start on 1st of July 2024. And the strategic priority for this plan is to navigate the increasingly complex environmental challenges, including climate change, land contamination and earthquake risks. So I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Any questions about the outline for today? Cool. Well, we'll get into, as Rhiannon suggested, the regional and district planning and that spatial plan. Jonathan.
Kia ora, and thank you for the gift of your attention today. So I've got 2 slides today. I'm keeping it deliberately high level, just because a lot of us don't have much time, so I don't want to get too far down into the detail. I just want to give you an overview of a couple of work streams that we have online at the moment, and also get some indications as to where you sort of see the burning issues. First of all, in the best traditional workshops, I would just like to do a very, very quick piece of work. In front of you, you'll find you've got some post-it notes and a pencil. I would just like you, without thinking too hard, to just write down what for you is the most pressing change you'd like to see delivered in Invercargill. It can be one word, no change is acceptable as well, no conferring. It should only take about 10 seconds, I'd say. So
no, just repeat the question, would you?
For you, what is the most pressing change you would like to see delivered for Invercargill? So it could be one word, a sentence. You can just quickly jot it down.
Sure. Because there's a big difference.
You mean environment or generally?
We'll go with generally this stage.
Generally.
Yeah.
So
And-
what's the question? Sorry, didn't hear the question.
So what for you is the most pressing change you'd like to see delivered in Invercargill?
Around our environment.
All right, anything.
We'll keep it general,
General.
and I think with the slides it'll allow you to get a bit more specific. I think it will become a bit clearer shortly. So whilst you do that, I'll speak to the regional spatial strategy first, and that's really part of what is the proposed RMA reform. So you'd remember from the original workshop I did on RMA reform, we've had no indication that it's slowing or it's not going ahead. We're still waiting for the last round of submissions and to get the findings back from those. But to all intents and purposes, it's going ahead, and that's our anticipation. Last year, agreement was reached at the mayoral forum for councils to begin to work on a joint regional spatial strategy. And we have started work on that, but again, it's at a high level. Now, for those of you that remember, the proposed RMA reform will feature us having to work on a joint spatial strategy. It's mandated. It's anticipated with the current time frame that those will be delivered in a period of about 5 years initially. That's across the country. Looking at other councils who have worked on a regional spatial strategy, Queenstown is probably the first that springs to mind. It's taken them 3 years to deliver theirs, and that was not a joint one. That was their own. They're an interesting case. They had some funding from central government, so we've taken that as an indicator that the process they went through is largely the process that would be expected through the RMA reform. So, as I said, we've started work on the regional spatial strategy together, and at this stage we're scoping and looking at the data that's going to go into it. We've had some joint meetings to consider what data we have available, what data would be good to have. Putting that together, we're expecting to receive the results around about mid-July that we'll be able to share with the council in regard to where that goes. But obviously, having a regional spatial strategy is really important, not just to the RMA reform, but actually to the region, how it's going to move forward from here, and how we're going to resolve many of the issues. So on the slide, I'll put down what the regional spatial strategy is designed to achieve. And I think the biggest question here is how Invercargill sees its future, the role the city plays within the region, and the role that the region will play in the city's future, because that's something that we want to embed into our contribution to the regional spatial strategy. Obviously, different councils will be seeking slightly different outcomes, but there is the potential here for us to work together to potentially resolve some of our issues. One of them, and I'm going to touch really lightly on this because we have another workshop coming up, but one of them is housing, and how we locate land that's suitable for development, and how we ensure there's enough houses to house the people that we see living here. And it may be that we have to look at other areas as supplying some of the housing needs, if we look at the concept of commuting, for example. As I say, I don't really want to get too deep into housing because that's going to be the subject of a whole other workshop. And a recent presentation that I watched in regard to Queenstown's spatial strategy, the mayor was at pains to say a regional spatial strategy is far more than just housing. So I think one of the questions is definitely how we see Invercargill moving forward from this point in time, particularly as part of the region. One of the things that I note is that we could consider ourselves a gateway to Southland, and yet we're at the bottom of the region. I've also noted that I travel from the top of the region to work here in Invercargill each day, so geographically we're spread quite away, and there's a lot of issues that creates for us. So we've done the first stage, and we're expecting to have a report back to you in July, and then that piece of work will identify what further work is required and is likely to require significant levels of further investment. We do envisage this taking quite a while to achieve. It won't happen overnight. One of the things that I do have in the back of my mind is taking a cue from Gore, who have already done some work in the spatial planning area. It could be a consideration that we have an interim piece of work to achieve a spatial strategy for Invercargill. I think that would allow us to have a plan in terms of the city, but also then have that plan to be able to put that as our contribution and further refine it as the work progressed. So that's one of the things I would cover. So yeah, I think the question really is, what key benefits does council want to see for Invercargill from a regional spatial strategy?
If that's not a rhetorical question, I'll go first. I guess recognition of the urban issues. It would be very easy, welcome Councillor Bond, it would be very easy for a regional strategy, particularly if it's being driven by Environment South, and to focus on environmental issues. And even from the district's perspective, they have more rural issues to deal with, but the issues that we have to deal with in an urban setting are very different to our neighbouring councils. Any other thoughts? Tom?
Could I ask a question first? I recall that council resolved that it did not want to be part of the pilot programme in this respect. How is this different from that?
So yeah, it's fair to say that this would tie in with the first tranche programme. There's two parts to it. The first tranche programme does offer central government funding if we were to go first. On the other hand, even if we don't participate in the first tranche programme, and to be clear, the details of that are still yet to be released. Even if we weren't to participate in the first tranche programme, I could see some real potential to creating a regional spatial strategy. It would allow us to identify what we want and where we want. In a simplistic way, it's a bit like the exercise you did at school where you set out the zoo. You couldn't have the lions next to the penguins because they'd eat them. We wouldn't want industry directly next to where we were going to develop residential. So I also, going back to my earlier point, if we consider housing needs, what we've identified so far through the work, and we'll be bringing more back in the workshop, is that different people have different needs at different stages of their lives. There is the potential for other councils to assist us with different style housing that's more supported in their area than our area, I'd suggest. So I can see some advantages. As to whether council chooses to be part of the first tranche programme when eventually it's announced, I have no particular thoughts.
Okay, so what you are doing at the moment does not bind us to be part of that first tranche programme,
No,
because it was
absolutely.
resolved by council that we would not. Okay, so I mean, then the answer to the substantial question, I mean, what I wrote was affordable housing for everyone, which means I think building more houses and the right type of houses, which is clearly part of the district plan or the regional spatial plan for the urban side.
Tell you one thing that was never considered heavily in the current operative district plan, which is one of those questions to throw out there. If there is an increased need for housing, do we need to consider in our housing requirements more intensified housing? And so, you know, is it appropriate now for us to be considering apartment units and apartments closer to town, or what suburbs could apartment living be appropriately located in?
The answer is yes. And I agree. I think that that's one of the things that's been right at the top of my mind when we've been thinking about housing, is that there are a number of people who, provided that they had means of access to upper floors, would happily live in a building that was 3 or 4 stories high. But it needs to be affordable, because most of what the inner city accommodation that is at 2nd or 3rd or 4th level is beyond most people's means. So there's a balancing act in there.
Can it mind if I comment on that? The Beyond 2025 housing paper, which I don't think many people have seen yet, coming out of that is the view that even if Invercargill may actually have enough housings, they have their own kind of houses. And there is a growing body of people who want to live in smaller homes. There's another growing body who want to live in much larger homes, intergenerational type homes. But there are also a growing body of people who want to live in apartments, which probably, if you asked the question 10 years ago, there'd have been very few people. But we've had a lot of migration. A lot of those people who've come in actually are used to apartment living and would like the opportunity to do that.
Thanks. Just a reminder, hang on, you're in a queue. Just a reminder that there is the housing workshop coming up in April as well. Rangi, thanks for waiting.
Cheers. The control of carbon sequestration, the use of land. Land is obviously valuable in our area, in the territorial authority that we have, and I think council should have some control over allowing valuable land to be just planted in trees so that someone can claim carbon credits and stuff. It's like we've got the ability, obviously, at Sandwich Point with controlled forestry and everything. But if you've got valuable land that someone owns and they decide, I'm going to plant it in Pinus and claim some carbon points, I don't think that's a good use of land. We should be able to have a say in how that land's used.
So control over where carbon sequestration.
Yeah, especially our city is such a small area. Yeah.
Thanks. Ria, sorry.
That's okay. I was just going to add comment to what Evelyn said about the housing. So we know that we've got an ageing population, and intensifying would be under that consideration for accessibility for people to have access to main travel routes in and out of town. I think another thought that comes to my mind is that we had Environmental Southland give us a presentation about a data collector of where's best to be building. So I think we have to keep that in the back of our mind as well. We don't want to build an area that they can predict from their data that will be an absolute long-term poor investment. So I think it is important that we do consider those areas when we get that data.
Thanks. Leslie.
Thanks, Chair. Urban sprawl is one thing I think we need to address in the plan, and that's one of the reasons why we should look at intensification and building upwards, because we do have a lot of valuable farmland and other land that should not end up with urban sprawl, and it's becoming a New Zealand-wide issue. And the other thing I think we need is some serious attention to our rivers and floodplains, and we have had a 100-year flood in 1984. We did some intensive work to build stop banks and so forth, but I think if we're going to have a regional spatial strategy, we need to make sure it caters for the sort of land we should not actually be building on, the managed retreat that people are now talking about more and more. I think in our whole region's case, it may not be so much managed retreat as labelling some areas of land close to our rivers and streams, etc., as not available for housing use or business use necessarily.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. That follows on from what I wrote on my post-it note, which was managed housing infill, because we want to maintain a balance between urban sprawl. We don't want to have to extend the infrastructure, particularly in areas where it's pretty much at capacity. If you look at north east, or is it northwest Invercargill, the pipes are almost full, and that's yet still where people want to sprawl out. But with urban infill, we've still got to make sure that we've managed the degree of intensification. So if we have lots of those little units like you do through Windsor, for example, where the sections are pretty much fully concreted, there's not a lot of porous surface for rainfall to make its way through, and that starts to create issues as well. Evelyn, then Rangi.
So very interesting you say that, Mr. Chair, because that was one of the points that I was going to make. The hardening off of so much of our surfaces is one of the issues that is intensifying the effect of very swift runoff in rain events. It was interesting to see in the Auckland event, where there was a community that was designed with a great deal of ability for water permeability in terms of wetlands and places that were intentionally left for that purpose. So given that we have some land that is less than optimal for housing and for other sorts of activities, whether we should be looking at actually allowing wetlands to be created or intentionally create them to cater for those sorts of things, but also how we address what is it permitted under a building consent in terms of how much of that section is actually hardened off. And I know people want to have a place to park their vehicles, but when we're seeing the parking being created for 4 buildings, vehicles, but there's also a garage and all the rest of it, deliberately creating the capacity to park cars or boats or whatever, but it's great for the people that own the houses. It's not great for the environment. Where is the balance in there, and what can we influence in those conversations?
Ringy?
Just getting a gauge on the conversation with infill versus outfill. Now, I just want to sort of get a feeling of how what this council thinks about the new development down Rockdale Road, Tramway Road. I mean, obviously 600 odd sections. The land was not really used for much, and to me, I think that's creates a nice new community and everything. But would that sort of thing in the future be frowned upon, or is it going to be case by case, or
It's a case by case. So going through being a part of the plan change for that area, one of the things that worked in its favour was that it's not hugely intensified, so there's still a small degree of property. There's a lot of amenity that's worked into the planning, and there was also capacity in the infrastructure.
So that leads to my next question. When we do create this 30-year spatial plan, there's a clause there, case by case, because that's basically what we have to leave the door
All
open?
planning is like that.
I know, but that's what I mean. It's very hard to create a plan, but it's not really a plan, because the case by case then creeps up. Someone comes up with a new idea. We got the one just to the north of the Adatara Golf Course there at Adatara. That's going to be quite a few sections. Each person with a hunk of land will come to council and say, I've got a case that this is a great idea. And obviously the whole Resource Management Act kicks in, and then we have debates and everything. So the plan really goes out the door, because if we have a case by case basis, why have a plan?
So the plan provides a mixture of guidelines and rules. Rules are the hard and fast stuff. Guidelines are indications of what's preferable. You wouldn't, for example, build a residential house next to a heavy industrial zone.
Oh, no, I understand that, but you're looking at this outlying land like the case I just talked about down Rockdale Road. Now, that's good use for it. I absolutely agree. But there's lots of examples, if we look around the perimeter of Invercargill, where that could happen.
Yep. So partially that was identified in the current district plan, and that was based around the areas where we would prefer to see development happen, where it's easier. And a lot of that was based on available land and capacity of infrastructure. So it's the same process.
So if you tag it case by case, but infrastructure dependent. I mean, the infrastructure is the key bit, isn't it?
Yep. Tom.
Yeah. A really critical issue to decide how you're going to treat it right from the beginning is what we assume the population is going to be in, 5, 10 years, 15 years time. And, I think we all know that a critical mistake that was made back in, maybe 20 years ago was that the stats people were forecasting that by this time, Invercargill's population would have fallen to 30,000. And of course it did not, climb back up again. And when again we see those housing statistics come out, there is a forecast going forward that again, Invercargill's population will fall in the 2030s. Quite significantly. That's it. So if you assume that, then we're going to end up frozen at the spot again, I think, as far as... and there's another argument that says, maybe as a consequence of climate change and issues up north, it might be far more people want to come and live in Invercargill. So we could see the reverse. We could see a significant population increase. So it's difficult to plan unless you have you either plan for a given population, or else you do what I think, Councillor Pottinger's saying, and that is that you've got to have a lot of flexibility in that plan, because you've got to be able to respond to changed circumstances.
So I'm just going to pause. I see you, Trish, and I'll hold on for a second, because we're dropping down into the district plan, which I think is the next slide you've got, Jonathan.
Should we move to the
Let's do it.
Okay, so this one deals with the district plan. So ICC's district plan was enacted in 2019. A few bits that I've drawn out of there. So as part, under the RMA, we're required to more or less continually review our district plan to check that it is effective, it's delivering the required outcomes, and to see if we can have any efficiencies. We did carry out an initial plan effectiveness report in 2021, which identified that further work was required. In particular, it was an assessment of housing capacity, and also how climate change will influence and shape Invercargill. So both pieces of work are underway. It's fair to say that progress hasn't been quite as quick as we'd like. We've been a little bit under-resourced in the policy area for planning, but we are starting to pick it up. And I think in some ways I see the district plan as going somewhat hand in hand with the regional spatial strategy. What I've taken from listening to the comments is that a regional spatial strategy would require sufficient flexibility to adapt to the changes that we could reasonably foresee, and also some we couldn't foresee over such a period. Likewise with the district plan, as I say, it's a relatively recent plan. It was enacted in 2019, so we're now 4 years in. And the question is, where to with the district plan from here? One of the considerations is that if we're going to go through RMA reform and we're going to change and have a regional planning committee and a regional plan, the question is, what do we need to do for the here and now in terms of the district plan, anticipating that in the future it will go? And I should put the caveat in that indications with the RMA reform currently are that we could potentially be working on a regional spatial strategy and district plan at the same time, and that will then raise a question about where we deploy our resources to. I know that when dealing with the district plan, it's quite quick to, it can be an easy fix to challenge it and say that it just doesn't work to deliver. What I would say is, in terms of district plan, if we look at the building side, one of the things I think Invercargill City can be really proud of is that we currently have one of the best performing building consent authorities in the country. That wasn't the case a few years ago. The changes that we made were around how we approached the building consenting side of things, and also how we approached the code. We didn't change the code. And one of the things I'm really interested in is how much we could change our approach with the district plan to get some efficiencies before we go into the avenue of exploring it. One of the reasons for that is that sometimes we go into things with the best of intentions, with an outcome in mind, but through the process of collaboration, it can change into something else, and we also have the unanticipated consequences of our actions. I think a good example where we could change our approach slightly would be, it's not uncommon for people to, on larger blocks of land where they're building a bigger home, initially they'll put up a smaller one, say a shed, that to all intents and purposes allows them to live in whilst they're building it. Our usual approach was then to insist that they made sure they couldn't reside in that smaller property once they'd finished the big one, to the point that we'd potentially ask them to remove a kitchen, say. I'd suggest that we probably don't want to continue that approach. We'd like to work with people. And I think in the spirit of injecting some trust into the relationship, we would advise them that you can't have two on one lot, so it needs to be used together. And so that to me is a quick efficiency with a district plan that could address an issue. So what I'm really keen to hear about is how we see the deficiencies with the district plan, if there are any. So what changes do we want, if any? and it can be a bit of a laboured process if we want to do some fairly significant changes. We need to scope them and then take them out for consultation before implementing them. So I think what I'm trying to say is that with the RMA reform coming, I'd just sound a note of caution about really going whole hog with the district plan at this stage, but I'm certainly keen to investigate it.
I mean, it's ludicrous to do a full district plan review while a spatial plan's being consulted on. But the beauty of the way the new district plans are constructed is you can do them piece by piece. You don't have to go through an entire review. And I guess one of the things that has served us well in the last year, 18 months, is the fact that we've been customer focused from that building consenting perspective. And if we're able to employ the same practices as much as we can in resource consenting rather than building consenting as well, particularly in around, I think, minimum lot size. And there was an example of good urban design, might have been Housing Corporation or some organisation that went below the minimum permitted lot size, but actually through their design developed good amenity. So you weren't, you know, walking straight into your neighbour's back door as you left. There was a degree of privacy, and being able to stamp those in different places should be an easy process where you see something that's been permitted that works, making that easy to be replicated. And I think the other thing we need to bear in mind, not that it's not permitted, is how do we address the issue of tiny houses? I mean, we had the presentation from the gentleman about 18 months ago, when we pointed out that tiny houses are possible, but how do we exercise some control around those? Trish, thank you for waiting.
So it's probably a little bit too much detail, but one of the things that is really important, I think, is that we consider our ageing population, some of our older houses, and our communities. So, you know, if we can get to the position where we can get perhaps older people or some people out of those big houses and convert the land to more on the same thing, they have a community, we need to make sure they've got transport options. But I think we can, that intensification of land has to include that aspect as well.
Pania,
I hear what you're saying too there.
do you want to pull that mic in a little, Pania?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Trish, but I'm just going back to two bits of housing development that I was fortunate to actually look at, and one was the Ngaitahu development in Canterbury, in Christchurch there, where the houses are far too close together and the roofs actually nearly touch, and there is no sort of leg room in any way or form. The other lot of housing on learnings was in Taita in Wellington, where they did this whole bit of community development, the council did, and they failed to put any sort of car parking facility with those apartments. And sadly the streets, and they showed me, was like, and the neighbours just cringe because there's no movement on the street because all these cars are parked along the streets and no one can get in and out of their housing because of it. So these are learnings.
My brother has a house in Wellington on a narrow street that they could not get a fire engine to when it was needed. Had to run lots of hoses.
So if we are going to consider anything in development, whether it's apartment or how shared type arrangements, we need to consider where there is a parking space.
Thanks. Evelyn.
So thinking back to the issue about the small blocks, the 1 hectare, one house type thing, when we know that there's now increasing pressure for people to have multi-generational living opportunities, but having some sort of a lifestyle opportunity as well, should they be mutually exclusive? I understand what you're saying, Jonathan, about the first, because it has been an issue over the years, the first property being a sort of a semi-garage type thing with enough facilities for people to camp for a period of time while they build, having to be decommissioned. Should we really be saying to people, if it's going to be occupied by a family member, like a parent, a grandparent, that sort of thing, that it's permissible but mustn't be used for rentals or things like that. Is that something that we're looking at? Because rentals would obviously detract from that lifestyle kind of vibe that they were originally intended to be, but still be flexible enough to accommodate what people, some families like mine, would really like to be the ideal, where when as you age you don't have to move off the property, you just move into a different part of the property and it's able to be accommodated. Is that one of the things that you were raising when you mentioned that?
So what I was trying to do is to say that we could potentially get some efficiencies. That is the current situation. You can have the two on the one lot if it's being used by the family. Obviously, there's a concern that over time something could develop whereby the property changed hands and it does somehow end up on the rental market, which is not what we want currently. But it's a case, to my mind, it's a case of explaining to the owner what their responsibilities are and actually putting the trust back into the relationship. And I see that as an efficiency we can get with the current district plan. So that was just one example of how by adjusting our approach to the current district plan, we can get some small wins.
I want to park housing and save the rest of it for the housing workshop. There's a couple of things from a district plan perspective that have come up that are really useful. I guess something I want to signal, Jonathan, is business zones and retail activity. So we've gone and invested a lot of money as a city in building the Central City Hub and wanting to place, I guess, tighter controls on what sort of retail activity can sprawl further out. From that hub, it should be easier for people to set up in here rather than, apart from residential, the nodes of like Windsor or South City or Glengarry. But also we probably need to be aware of home occupations, particularly those that have an effect on neighbours. Now there's a difference between someone who might be running a hair salon from their home and that's permitted because they don't employ more than a couple of people, but they are getting away cleverly with cheaper rates, or people who run their offices from homes. But there are also people who become panel beating businesses, which is not something that should be happening in a residential area. So tightening up on some of those home occupations in residential zones is something we'd need to look at. Rangi, and then Tom.
Funny you should raise that. I mean, obviously, just thinking about certain developments that went through the Resource Management Act to get established in Invercargill, and you take a garden centre that requires quite a bit of land. If you want to set up one of those, you're going to struggle to find land in our zones. You need to be almost going semi-rural or to find some space, and there's a lot of businesses like that that I don't think you can stop. Again, it must be case by case. If they've got if their environmental impact is okay, they're providing the amenity value is good. It's not looking terrible. So I think creating these strict industrial areas or business areas, it's a bit tough.
Just until someone sets up next to your house.
No. But I'm saying like an example of that. So you don't put a nursery, you don't put a Nichols or a Dyax. I mean, where are they going to find the land? I mean, they're going to find some.
So in those examples, you've just got to worry about traffic impact actually, because they're low noise. There's not a lot of noise there, but there's a lot of traffic coming and going. I guess as long as there's good traffic routes and you can get onto and off the roads easily, that shouldn't be an issue. But you're right, it's about finding where that land
like
is.
say if a Bunnings came to town, where would they?
Don't we have one?
No, we've got the commercial one, but we haven't got the retail one. So where would they sort of find a massive area?
Sure, the Cunninghams would leap up and say.
Yeah.
Tom.
Changing the subject a little bit, although obviously interfaces with housing, but we do need, I think, as part of work in the next short number of years, to be having a plan that deals with the issue of adaptation to climate change. and where must we consider managed retreat? Where are we able to protect the city just through various means? And I know that we are going to talk about that maybe this afternoon. We get probably more time now to do it, but that an awful lot of that goes to the amount of data that we have, which is inadequate at the moment, lacking LIDAR data and precise heights and so forth. But I think part of the next plan we have is going to have to be, I think, maybe not precise decisions, but certainly these are areas which, if there's a metre rise in sea level, we simply cannot protect. Here are areas where we believe we can protect. It might take 30 years to develop the protection, but we believe we are going to be able to protect it. I think those sort of decisions are going to have to be taken in the next few years, which probably means, in line with the development of this plan.
Excellent timing, Tom, because it's a beautiful segue.
Okay.
From district planning into climate change. Before we get into the matter in greater detail when Environment South and get here, sorry Barry, was there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'm I've been concerned for a long time about the old wrecks at, especially in Bay Road and
Industrial
everything.
land.
Yeah. What about all the leakage that comes off those vehicles?
So I understand that's under investigation. Good point, though. I mean, it's a visual eyesore and everybody gets that, but it's in an appropriately zoned area. So I know that our staff at Environment Southland are looking at, well, what's the potential on the water plane in that area?
Great stuff, thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So if I may, before I go, if you could just take the time to decide if you're happy with the answer you've got on your post-it note. If you're not, please feel free to change it. I would love to collect them in and just use them as a pointer for the further bit of work I need to do.
Thanks, Jonathan.
I'll collect them in at lunch to save time.
Rhiannon.
Yes, so excellent segue from the Deputy Mayor there, who is Council's representative on the regional working group, along with Councillor Leslie Soper. So you may both have things that you want to add in comments. We have a few slides, myself and Leo. So Leo, do you just want to come forward maybe and sit at the table there? We're just going to run through a little bit of a summary. You'll have also received the paper that's in the council agenda for this meeting with an update on our approach to climate change. So council has been working on this issue in an establishatory kind of phase for a while now. In the existing long-term plan, there are a number of focus areas that are laid out, and the officers have been working to improve the knowledge and data that we have across the issue of climate change to put us in a better position to support you making decisions going forward. So the first focus area is to understand first and manage council's own climate impact, so understanding the impact of council's activities on carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions, and Leo's going to talk more about that in a moment. Secondly, to understand and manage risk to our key council infrastructure, particularly firstly those parts of infrastructure that are essential to life, water infrastructure, roading, etc. And thirdly, to support regional work to set a climate strategy for the city as part of a wider regional strategy. So it's great to see that the Regional Climate Change Working Group has been established now by Environment Southland and Te Marama, and we are involved in and supporting that piece of work. In the meantime, Council's been looking at its own activities and making sure that we are in the best position possible on the issue of climate change. Obviously, climate change is a very complex issue. There are still a lot of uncertainties and unknowns in terms of how it is going to impact on the region and when. So I've outlined here on this slide some proposed principles really for your consideration as we approach this issue. One has already been mentioned, and that is a data-led approach. So we'll give a bit more of a detail in a moment about where the knowledge on climate change for the region sits. But it is really important to make sure that we understand what the issues are that the region faces and when those are likely to arrive, and we don't yet have all the data that we need in order to be able to do that. That we think that it's sensible to take a regional approach which considers risks and opportunities. There are some opportunities potentially for the region from changing climate patterns in terms of new business opportunities, crops, etc. that may be available. Although, of course, the risk profile is the one that has been considered more to this point and remains considerable. So within the existing long-term plan, we have based our climate change assumptions on the 2018 NIWA study that looked at the impacts of climate change within Southland. We have used the mid-range forecasts, and sorry, that's distracting me slightly. Those mid-range forecasts relate to primarily the risks of increasingly intense high rainfall events and the risks of flooding that come with that, the risks of high temperature, increasing periods of high temperature and what that might mean for drought, and also the impact of sea level rise on low-lying areas. So those are already built into the assumptions that Council is operating on. It's particularly relevant in areas like in the engineering services team and the types and sizes of pipes that they put in to replace infrastructure that's aging in the city. Also propose taking a holistic policy making and risk assessment approach. Climate change can't be considered on its own. Policies that will interact and affect climate change will have significant costs attached. There are high levels of uncertainty in many areas, and so it's really important to consider and weigh up, as you will do in all of the issues that you're facing in long-term planning, how you manage those kind of cost issues and balance issues and risks against other factors in the long-term planning. And then we've focused on the regional strategy and the district plan, and so having a sense of where we are going as a region, but keeping within Council's control clear targets and activities. So those are some proposed principles as we approach this issue of climate change. So this next slide shows the work structure for the regional working group. The exact structure of what the strategy is that comes out of this working group is still to be formed. There's been one meeting so far. This is the framework that Environment Southland and Te Aomarama, with the support of the other councils, is putting forward in terms of an approach. It really focuses on two issues of adaptation and emissions reduction. It looks at firstly what needs to happen, where is there an interagency approach, and where is it relevant for councils to continue to move and act on their own. We're very cognizant of the fact that we can't wait for the regional strategy. We need to be moving as well and looking at what council's responsibilities are, and that has been set up through the existing long-term plan. And then there is the opportunity to consult the community on the strategy as part of each council's long-term planning consultation process. So we as a council have been already doing things in the space of adaptation and emissions reduction. Leo's going to run through some of those aspects now.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody else. My name is Leo. I'm the lesser member of the policy team, and here to take you through the wonderful maze of climate change action policy. So, as you know, effectively any element of climate change action has two wings to this bird. One, of course, adaptation, and the other one is mitigation. The mitigation policy and the mitigation aspect is effectively about reducing the amount of greenhouse gas that we emit into the atmosphere, as well as decarbonizing the atmosphere, taking it out of it. And of course, the adaptation is really about producing a degree of physical, economic, demographic, and biosecurity resilience to the detrimental effects of climate change. So, in the first wing, so to speak, about the mitigation, which is really about emission reduction, before we go into that one, just one point is that there is some legislative framework around this element. There is a Carbon Response Act and a Carbon Response Act amendment, the Zero Carbon, that effectively lead the central government to attach itself to the target of achieving a net zero by 2050. Some may consider that at this stage, given of course how far we've come, probably not as realistic or as achievable as initially was expected, but of course this policy and this legislation is dynamic. In terms of progressing the emission reduction and engaging in mitigation policy, the first critical step is always setting the carbon baseline. We have effectively done this for the last financial year. It has yielded the result, which is not entirely surprising for an organization of this size, and there's no great anomaly. It's 15,590 ton of greenhouse gas. It's not just CO2, it is CO2 equivalent. So they all kind of lump it into one for the simplicity of analysis. The sources of emission are, again, there's no great anomaly here. They are either by direct action of council, in this case the primary source being the treatment, the operation of treatment of wastewater plants, and followed by indirect emission by purchased electricity, purchased power for transportation, as well as procurement of goods and services. So this is basically what we have done so far. This baseline allows us to measure our progression in the future as we move on to reduce our emission by any means and mechanism that is available to us. So this is a critical part. Many effectively TAs in New Zealand have not taken this particular step, so we have done effectively quite progressive in this regard. In terms of the steps we have to take to reduce the emission, as well as taking that embedded carbon from the atmosphere, as you can see on the right side, we have taken some steps. Those examples are quite interesting. The boiler in the Splash Palace have moved from the lignite to wood chip. The hybrid vehicle transition of the General Council vehicle fleet has started. All the maintenance machinery in the parks have effectively moved from fossil fuel to electricity, and 33,000 building property documents have been digitized or in the process of digitization, as well as, of course, this being the norm now, we have tried to establish attending in corporate meetings through video conferencing softwares, which effectively cut down on the prospect of commuting all the way. And the tree planting measure, which is truly about planting a tree for every resident of the city. So you can see overall, and also in comparison to the TAs across the country, our actions in this wing of emission reduction has been significant. And I guess one question for us to consider here is that whether we wish to achieve that net zero state by 2050 or any other kind of a time frame we wish to attach ourselves to. And of course, the second question would be, where is the scope and the limitation of our ambition? Is it something that we only, if we decide to go down that path of achieving true net zero, that would be, our emission would effectively be neutralized by the other measures actually we've taken to offset that emission, just for this organization, or do we intend to expand it to the wider community by any degree that we can achieve? So that's the first question that we wish to gain some guidance from this body.
Tom, then Rangi, then Evelyn.
Chair, obviously, this is a subject that I've been quite a lot involved in, and I'm actually encouraged that, when I look at the size of the issue, I mean, global climate change is a massive issue, but if we look at the effect in Invercargill, to me, it's manageable if we start now. But if we talk just about mitigation for a minute, and we produce about 15,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year. Now that is ICC, that is not the city, and we have at some point to understand what the city emits, but ICC, 15,000. If we were to aim for net zero, let's suppose we could, by all of the programs that we are already undertaking, if we could reduce that by half, let's just suppose, which I think is entirely reasonable, then to buy offsets, to buy carbon offsets, it would cost us about $500,000 a year to offset the remaining 7,500 or so, $500,000 a year. If we were to decide to do it through planting, it would be about 500 hectares. If we planted 500 hectares of native forest on unproductive land, it would offset the balance of the carbon that we emit. So that seems to me as a challenge. It's more akin to climbing Bluff Hill than it is to climbing Mount Everest. I mean, it's perfectly doable, it seems to me. So I think if we set a mind to it, and it would be quite possible for us to commit to net zero as ICC within a reasonably short period, actually, certainly medium-term period. I'll leave it at that. I've got other comments about adaptation, but let's just we're talking about mitigation at the moment.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate that. Rangi?
Thanks, Chair. Look, I'm pleased to actually raise this because it was coming up this afternoon. I'm just pondering electricity. Now, our electricity comes from hydro. I'm just wondering where you get this carbon emission. Can you tell me the calculations behind the production of hydroelectricity or wind electricity, why it's up there?
I guess I can answer this question in the context of a wider consideration regarding some of these assessments. And the first point to consider here.
I'm just asking the science behind it.
Yes. So first of all is that these projections are either through what we call raw data, that they actually do have, say, for example, somebody who's producing electricity or producing emission through exhaustion of engines and all that. They do have effectively technological equipment that can measure that quite clearly at their end. And of course, electricity is something that has been produced indirectly by us, and of course, a purchase from somebody else. In the report, the quality of the data associated with electricity has been considered quite high, indicating that the producer of that electricity has measured that information by technical and technological means very, very accurately, between 90 to 100% accuracy. The way they can do that, I guess one of the ways they can achieve this is by implementing certain monitoring softwares that can effectively create an equivalence between every unit of electricity used and every unit of greenhouse gas that actually may have been produced or has been produced through the process. In terms of the report projection and of course how they have produced this, it seems to indicate, because of the data quality associated with that particular one, projection of electricity, is that highly accurate technological instruments have been used to measure that GHG emission, that greenhouse gas emission produced by that. But the report is silent on this in itself.
Well, just look at the Clyde Dam, for example. You've got water falling through gravity, spinning turbines, and electricity is produced. Comes down a power line, goes into a whole lot of transformers, and gets to us. Yeah. Now, I'm really struggling to believe that there's any emission in that process. And that's why I'm asking you, please explain the science, because you've got a very high number up there, 12.5. Every time we turn the light switch on, we're creating emission. You know, like it just, you know, it's very hard to, I mean, I want to come on board with this, but when you put something like that up there, I'm going, shit, this is weird.
Tom, perhaps you can help out with that.
I think I know the answer to that one, actually, Rangi. You're obliged to use the grid factor when you calculate your emissions, which means that if, say, 17% of New Zealand's electricity is produced from fossil fuels, you're obliged to count that in your calculation. Does it make any difference where your own electricity comes from?
No.
That's the way. But no, that's the way they count.
You got to be joking. So the fact that we're factoring in the Huntly Power Station into our electricity use.
Well, that's how it's done. But actually, sometimes we are actually getting power from Huntly Power Station. You got to remember that in dry years and so forth, we do actually import to the South Island electricity made from fossil fuels.
Just at 12.5 is incredibly high.
Yeah. But that's just the way it's just the way it's done. You know, it doesn't make any difference if you could be hooked up to a hydro station. You're still required to use the grid factor.
Okay. Evelyn.
Yeah, I was going to say, because you create these effects by even the hardware that you need to run these things. Everything that you manufacture creates greenhouse gas. But anyway, that was not really the point. I think that I'm pleased that we're discussing it. I'm pleased that we're looking at it from what the council can do. I think one of the things that, as well as getting our own house in order, is the messages that we send to the community. One of the things I firmly believe that we're here to be is leaders and thought leaders and action leaders. So if we are encouraging activities that reduce carbon, for example, planting natives at Sandy Point, where once always was natives. So it's not that they won't grow there, it's we've chosen to grow pinus there because it's been a revenue generation activity for the council. We won't talk about how good a revenue generator it was, but it has been a revenue generator or seen to be that. If we plant natives there, because of their long lifespan, they offset those carbon, you know, the greenhouse gases for a much longer period of time, plus which they actually add some stability and attract native birds and things like that, which is something that adds to our enjoyment of the place. I think we've got to actually encourage people to think that the one tree they plant in their section that is not going to be harvested, but is going to grow shelter and add to the environment, also contributes to the reduction of greenhouse gas. The little things we do, not just the big things we do, and that if we send those messages by what we do as well, but encouraging people to make change, being an influence, a positive influence for this matter.
So thanks, Leo. I think that's a firm maybe. You know, it's a good aspirational thing, and let's get information to help flesh out and work towards our moving on, Rangi, because there's another question, and that was, do we look at internal contestable funds? Do you want to flesh that out for us, Leo?
Probably Rhiannon would be better positioned to cover that.
So yeah, I'll speak to this. So you'll notice when you get reports from council managers that they talk about the climate change implications in those reports. Many of the low-hanging fruit, as you can see to the right-hand side, has been picked in terms of areas where it is easier to reduce our carbon emission. That doesn't mean that there aren't further easier opportunities, but we are getting towards the point where difficult investment decisions will be made. There are a number of ways of doing this. It can be just built into the activity planning. When they put it forward, they'll say, here are your options, councillors. This one is cheaper, but it's not going to achieve your carbon outcome. Therefore, we recommend this more expensive option. That requires a level of maturity that, in terms of being able to assess carbon impact, that we as a council, I would say we are not there yet, and many and most councils in New Zealand are not yet there, because it takes a lot of work to be able to fully assess what the carbon impact. Therefore, one way that councils have been supporting action is by having an internal contestable fund where different teams within the organisation can say, we want to do this project, and they can shape it up as a project that doesn't then need to align as closely with planning cycles, and they can apply for funding. This is really just an opportunity for you to start to think about your kind of a preferred approach, and then we can bring that back in later in the LTP process when we get to budgeting towards the end of the year.
Rhiannon, can you tell me, with the other councils that have used that, has that inspired innovation?
Yes, it has inspired innovation in some areas. Like many of these things, there's been challenges also. So it has been primarily larger councils that are really progressing on this type of thing. Things, Wellington, Auckland would be further along than many of the smaller councils, because this is a challenging issue to address.
Tom.
Chair, I support that approach, but it's essential that when we do that exercise, that we are considering offsets as well, because the whole point of carbon charges is to make sure that economically the money goes to the right projects. So there's no point in to save, a ton of carbon, you spend $1 million. It makes no sense at all. You'd be better to spend the $70 and buy the ton of carbon. So I think offsets have got to be considered, particularly planting as an alternative, which is often much cheaper than actually buying the very expensive gizmo So I'd support the approach, provided it built into the analysis is that question of offsets.
Thanks, Tom. Rangi.
Just looking at the right-hand column there, and considering solutions, do we have to, and Evelyn touched on it before, do we have to consider the carbon footprint of the solution? So let's try hybrid vehicles, and do we have to take an account, say it came from China, they used, which is mainly coal-fired electricity, and where the lithium came from, everything like that. Do we have to take that into account, or do we park that and just say, look, we've got this feel-good factor about buying a hybrid vehicle. Forget about how it's made. We don't want to know that. Do we have to do that for any solution we find? Look at the carbon footprint of the solution.
Absolutely, it should be assessed in the decision making, and that's where
I don't see it up there, that's all.
that's where I'm making reference to the maturity. Like, that is a complicated thing to do, and it's not straightforward. So that is why many councils are taking an alternative route, because it takes time to build up the knowledge within the organisation.
So have we done that for our electric vehicles in the car park?
No, there's been a cost benefit assessment that has been easier to do, because essentially there hasn't been a great cost decision involved. It's been, that's what I mean when these are some of the more easy decisions to make, because there are financial benefits as well. It is going to get more complicated and difficult from here on out. So you are raising very valid points, and I'm just being completely open about the maturity of the organisation to be able to fully assess those decisions. We are not there yet. Most organisations around New Zealand are not there yet.
Okay, let's jump ahead to the subject that Tom touched on before. So I'm interested to hear what you've got to say. First of all, introduce the slide around adaptation.
Right. So adaptation effectively really got the long and the short of it. This is all about the accuracy of data. So we at the previous slides back, we just talked about the state of the data available to us in this region. Effectively, this is, as it stands, is a fairly high level data in which, of course, we have a general high level understanding of the impacts of climate change on in terms of especially sea level rise, as well as the recurrence of flooding events and heavy rain. But predominantly this is based on the 2018 NIWA studies. The NIWA studies, in the lack of LiDAR, which is the highest resolution, of course, data you can possibly get, relies on a less accurate set of data, predominantly being the first generation of digital elevation models, which is as accurate as 4 to 5 meters. Well, of course, LiDAR is far more accurate, down to, in fact, several centimeters. So in terms of adaptation, effectively, this whole thing is all about the marriage of three concepts. One is, what scenario is actually going to occur in terms of the sea level rise, in terms of the flooding events, coastal erosion, and all that sort of stuff. So that is one point of determination, which of course effectively NIWA has taken somehow between two scenarios that are considered to be the most likely, and of course projected a certain level of sea level rise within the midterm 2045 and long term to 2090. This particular assertion about what, of course, a sea level rise is going to be is going to effectively determine the type of the coastal erosion, coastal inundation, salt intrusion is going to occur. On the other side, the assumption is also going to shape the recurrence of flooding events. The amount of the heavy rainfall is going to, of course, occur. And that, of course, is a second part of this critical assumption that has been shaped. So in that sense, when you look at the NIWA's report, it does provide a high quality, a high level data about general assumptions regarding effects of climate change in the region, but it is not as accurate as a LiDAR modeling that can possibly provide, because LiDAR is far more accurate in terms of determining the topography of a region that is going to respond, to be subjected to the effects of sea level rise and riverine flooding. So in that sense, regardless, of course, of the completion of LiDAR, which of course is still ongoing, Council has effectively responded to even those high-level assumptions by especially responding to the possibility of the sea level rise, as was projected. For example, the project in the Cedar Street flood bank is one response to that. The increase in the specifications of the stormwater pipes is a response to the prospect of heavier flooding, as well as a few other projects that are effectively manifestations of Council's response to NIWA's mid-range assumptions about the effects of climate change as reflected through its infrastructural planning. But if I can use a military term here, it's coming from a military background myself, this is a very good and apt metaphor. if you have infinite amount of ammunition, you can effectively just use it with complete liberality. But when the resources and ammunition is in fact finite, then you require as accurate as data you can possibly get to inform your investment and planning decision making. So in that particular sense, as of course the report that we have that we commissioned from Duncan and Taylor, it effectively comes to reinforce assumptions that of course the NIWA report produced, but provided us with a very clear view for the critical need for as accurate information we can possibly get to show us the true impact of the climate change scenarios on coastal erosion, on salt intrusion, on coastal inundation, on riverine flooding. Without that data, without that clear data, investment and planning decision making will have to be high level. With that data, then you would exactly know what to do and where to do, and that information can effectively feed into complex modeling process, which can tell us quite exactly, quite precisely, where, for example, a stop bank has to be developed, where a new type of an approach or a new engineering design have to be implemented for certain stormwater designs. Where are the floodplains and the flood banks are going to be? So it's an interesting question, I guess, about the estuary, which is a highly complex environment because it is a concentration of a variety of factors that can effectively be fundamentally influenced by climate change. That particular estuary is a good example, as I said, of why LiDAR is effectively needed. The Duncan and Taylor's report repeatedly focused on the fact that this information is essential. This report, which of course we have initially commissioned to show us the impact of climate change, the negative impact of climate change on our critical infrastructure, effectively evolved to be a gap analysis. They told us, well, we don't have this information. You do need the LiDAR to be able to mature this information so we exactly come to know what are going to be the effects, these adverse effects on critical infrastructure. So one question, of course, here is that this LiDAR information is supposed to be available sometimes between the end of 2023 and early 2024. But one question, as has been raised there, is what is the appetite of this body for a more regional approach and a more regional collaboration for the development and accumulation of a high resolution data? It's, as I said, this is a critical factor. Your planning is going to be as effective as accurate data you're going to build it upon.
Synopsis makes good sense because it's going to essentially help inform the stuff that we're going to need to do for our district plan and also for the regional strategy. Tom?
Yeah. So, I mean, I support what's been said. The Stead Street project was absolutely the right thing to do, and it was bleeding obvious that it needed to be done. As you go beyond that, I think we have to fight the temptation to just sort of go on and do stuff because we feel there's a sense of urgency. You know, we need to do the right stuff, and I think the right thing to do is going to become more obvious when we get LiDAR data and we can do the analysis on that. If you don't quite get it right, it's very, very easy to get it horribly wrong. And I mean, what comes into my mind is the famous Kawarau Dam project where they built that with the intention of draining the river so that they could pick up the gold. Unfortunately, got the height slightly wrong and the water flowed backwards, and it never actually. And that was just a matter of getting heights slightly wrong. And the reality is that the systems that we're using now to determine the precise relative heights is not that much more sophisticated than it was back then. So I think we really need the LiDAR data. That work is ongoing. And then I think once we have that, we have to be part of a process which certainly is going to be done regionally, I've got no doubt, which allows us to determine what are the right things to do to protect the city and protect Bluff and to protect those other parts of this area that we need to. And personally, I think it's all doable as long as we again do the right stuff.
Ria.
Leo, with your commentary that you've just touched on with the slide, you pointed out that the LiDAR data is quite essential. I guess, I'm all for improving what we're doing in order to protect our environment and climate. My question and concern is about the quantitative outcome to different scientific data, to different organisations. So how do we quantify that we're not going to find ourselves in a contradiction in the future to different scientific data telling different information? What are we expected to do in terms of if we have LEADER or another organisation and that data is completely opposite to what the other is telling us? What would be?
Well, I guess it depends on what do we mean by contradictory data. Are you referring to the fact that the LiDAR may in fact yield results that is contradictory to, to our current assumptions?
Actually, I don't think that was what Rhea was suggesting. I think she was asking, what about organisations using different reporting mechanisms? And the answers are in conflict.
Yeah, you're right. That's one point, but there was also my second point was about the inconsistency.
Well, I guess once we have the most accurate kind of a data, then that will have to become effectively the primary point of reference. Well, one thing about, again, of course, about the LiDAR, we have to really kind of take into account. It's that current planning seems to be residing on the digital elevation models, as well as the existing vertical land movements. So we have these two offsetting kind of factors that move around to show, right, the sea level rise is going to be this one. And then, for example, we have also the vertical land movement, as well as a contour. So this existing data, of course, as you mentioned, has come to form many decision-making bases. The LiDAR is probably going more likely to be to refine that. I'm not an expert, I guess, on the LiDAR data. It's an interesting question whether, of course, a LiDAR high-resolution thing is going to contradict it or not, as opposed to refine it to a way that's going to focus and concentrate decision-making accuracy. But that's a very interesting question. I can, of course, research it up and find it out, but
So
I'm not entirely sure what the answer is.
Leslie, Rhianna?
Yeah, so I think it's just worth noting that that's a major issue, Rhea, and that's why we're recommending and where we are working together as a region. There are many different bits of data involved, and that's, I guess, the thing that I really want to flag is even once we have LiDAR, that is not going to solve all the problems. There is complex modelling that is going to take time that then needs to be done, and it all needs to interrelate. For example, river flood modelling requires digitisation of historic data at Environment South, and it requires all kinds of additional scientific input. So I guess what we're trying to flag is that this is complex and it's likely to cost more money, and it's going to take time to get this information.
Final question before we take a break. Otherwise, we'll eat into the break. Leslie?
It's not a question, Darren. It was a statement.
Yep.
I'm all for the collection of as much data as we can collect. I mean, LiDAR is essential to us moving forward. From my point of view, history is littered with seat of the pants, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, unintended consequences, projects that we can avoid by collecting as much data to give us the way forward as possible. I think if we don't collect it, we are just going to follow the old pattern of what looks like a good project but turns out with lots of unintended consequences that do our region a disservice. And just on the regional approach, to me, it's an absolute no-brainer. On this issue, it makes perfect sense to work as a region. Why would we even contemplate going alone on an issue like that is crossing our regional boundaries in every way, shape and form, and with the data alone being regional data? So it's perfect sense to work as a region.
Pani, was it a quickie?
Yeah, it's a very quickie because it's actually supporting what Leslie just said, because we're on the same page. I mean, I'm all for quality data as well as researcher, but I think we still have to build on to that, is to get on with having some action around everything, because otherwise it's like the health system. We can continually want better data around our mortality rates and everything like that, but that takes time, and so it's going to take a lot of time to get all the data pulled together and quality data at that. So to me, I think we just need to focus on the reduction of all the greenhouse type gases and everything else that we need to do around climate change.
Thanks, Pania. Councillors and guests, that's where we're going to take a break. We have some guests coming from the Regional Council to present, and we will be resuming that at 1:45. So we will pause the live stream and I'll adjourn the work. Welcome back to this reconvened LTP workshop looking at region and environment, particularly to those who are joining us again on the live stream for the first part of the afternoon session. Just a reminder, actually, that no decisions are made at a workshop. The councillors and representatives are discussing ideas which will ultimately help to inform documents that we'll send out for consultation. Then we'll get feedback on the consultation, and then in open meetings those decisions are made. It's for those who are joining us on the Zoom. So we reconvene, and it's my pleasure to welcome both Karen Wilson and Lucy Hicks from Environment Southland. And Karen's kicking us off first of all with a look at the New River Estuary. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou katoa. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to your workshop to talk about New River Estuary. I am the Chief Scientist at Environment Southland, but I am born and raised in Southland, so New River Estuary, like many of you, is near and dear to my heart. So I'm just going to quickly run through some of the key indicators that tell us a bit about the health of the estuary, the first being sedimentation. So as I'm sure you'll all appreciate, if you get too much sediment going into an estuary, that can smother life in the estuary. It can inhibit light getting into the water, and so a little bit's fine, but too much is a bad thing. And as this slide shows, at a lot of the monitoring sites in the estuary, the sedimentation rates are very good, but in the Waihopai Arm in particular, we're seeing sedimentation rates about 10 times more than the guideline value. So just to show you what that actually looks like, for those of you that aren't getting out into the estuary regularly, it looks like this. If you have a look at some of these photos, you'll see that the sediment's really black, and it's quite what we call anoxic, so it's quite stripped out of oxygen, so it'll have that sulfur smell, that rotten egg smell, and that basically means that there's very little oxygen in those sediments. And of course, you know, macroinvertebrates and snails, all those types of things, need oxygen in order to sustain life. So not only is there too much sediment, but that sediment that we're seeing in there is stripped of oxygen, which is not a great thing. One of the other key indicators that we look at is macroalgae, which is another name for seaweeds. And so again, seaweeds in small amounts are okay, but when you get too much seaweed in the system, that can again smother life in the estuary, and it also, when that dies off and settles down on the bed of the estuary and decomposes, again that decomposition will strip the oxygen out of sediments as well, so it fuels in that cycle that I was just talking about. So this is some photos of macroalgae in the estuary, and you can see that the combination of macroalgae and sediment does not paint a particularly nice picture. Here's how macroalgae though has changed over time in the estuary. So this is showing a bit of a time series from 2001 through to 2021, and basically the key thing to look for is sort of those orangey colors, and that's showing where there's just too much macroalgae growing. And you can see once again it's up in that Waihopai Arm where we're seeing some pretty adverse effects occurring with macroalgae. And I think if I was to pick one slide that really probably shows a bit of a story of the New River Estuary, it's probably this one, which is around seagrass. Now, seagrass is something that we actually want to see in the estuary because it provides refuge areas, and it's also a really important breeding ground for fish and also for birds who like to eat some of the macroinvertebrates that occur in there. So again, this is in the Waihopai Arm where we're seeing some of those seagrass meadows essentially disappear between 2001 and 2021. So I've pulled out this quote from a recent report that basically sums up the situation in New River Estuary. And the authors who do a lot of work around the country looking at estuary health, have said overall the widespread presence of persistent and entrained macroalgae beds, extensive patches of extreme sediment anoxia, progressive seagrass losses. They all serve as clear indicators that the capacity of the estuary to assimilate nutrient loads is being dramatically exceeded. The scale of the symptoms that we're seeing is unprecedented in New Zealand, according to these authors, and emphasises the urgent need to manage sediment and nutrient loads to prevent further adverse impacts. So probably should just qualify this by saying this is not the whole estuary, but certainly there are very sensitive areas, particularly up in the Waihopai Arm and around Daffodil Bay. They tend to be depositional zones, and we're seeing some really, really concerning results. So it's very short and sweet, but yeah, and as you all know, the estuary has been significantly modified over the past 150 years by both urban and rural development, and that is very much influencing some of the results that we're seeing. As I just said, the two areas that are most, I guess, that are of most concern are the Waihopai Arm and Daffodil Bay, and that we have done some work that have looked at different causes that are going into the estuary, and we do know that discharges from the city are a significant contributor, and that some modelling was done to sort of look at so I know that one of the confusing things is that a lot of nutrient load and a lot of water comes in from the Aridi Arm, as well as so the question is kind of how much of that goes into the estuary and circulates back up into the Waihopai Arm versus how much is coming in through the Waihopai Arm itself or through city discharges itself. So we've done some modelling to look at those dynamics. We've got pretty good information around the wastewater, but the one area we don't have really good information around is the closed landfill. So last summer, some work was done trying to look at sort of a preliminary study looking at what some of those landfill discharges might be going into the estuary. And particularly they sampled sediment around the closed landfill area and in what some people refer to as Pleasure Bay, that little inlet that's around that area. And so some of the conclusions from that study sort of showed that there were definitely elevated levels of arsenic, mercury, nickel, copper, phosphorus and zinc, but that the sediment samples were below, the ones that were taken in the bay itself were below the human health guidelines, but they were, some of them were above the levels for which you would look to have for ecological protection. But the problem with the study that was done was that it was pretty hard to tell from the way the study was designed how much of what we were seeing in that bay area was coming from the closed landfill versus coming in from the estuary into that bay area. So there's still quite a little bit more work needing to be done to sort of better understand some of the dynamics just within that sort of Waihopai Arm area itself.
So Karen, have you got a timeline or a plan on what that work looks like?
Yes, so Environment Southland, ICC and TAMI and a number of agencies are working together to pull together, I guess, the scope of works around what the next study needs to be to advance that research. I think that is close to being completed, but I haven't seen the final version yet.
And you're not sure when that's likely to be completed as yet?
I think that will be subject to funding, so it is very relevant for LTP discussions, but I don't have that information with me. I don't know if Lucy's aware of that.
No, aware that the work is happening, and ideally we'll have the results in order to inform the plan change, the water plan change coming. So notification for that's intended in the middle of next year. So if we have that information at hand to inform the policy decisions for that, that would be what we're aiming for.
Thanks. Councillors, questions or feedback? Alan.
Just one quick question. A few years ago, they used to spray the grass in the estuary. Was that the same grass we're talking about? I think it was called Spartina grass, or was that just, that's a different grass again?
Yeah, so that is a different grass again, so that's an introduced species.
Because what they sprayed would have killed everything, wouldn't it? That's what I'm
I
thinking.
believe that shouldn't have been killing off the seagrass, the native seagrass. It was targeted at Spartina only.
Right.
Evelyn.
So I'm guessing when you talk to the closed landfill, you're talking about the recently closed one as opposed to historic. When you talk about the Waihopai Arm, where you're looking at the results of modification, including infill and a landfill of an historic nature, how much of that is fed by what is coming down the Waihopai alone, or what is coming out, or do you think is coming out of other discharges into the water, for example, uncontrolled stormwater or those sorts of things?
Yes, so we've done a bit of work to look at the different contributions of different sources, particularly around nutrients in the estuary. And I guess there's two ways of approaching it. One is you basically do an accounting approach, which is you just count up all of the discharges occurring in the catchment from the farming sector and everything you know, and then look at those relative contributions, and which we have done, that has been reported. The problem with that approach, though, is that say a dairy farm discharging up at Mosbin, their nutrients can be attenuated by the time it gets down to an estuary. So you know, that can be, as it moves down through the Oriti River, periphyton and other plants can take up those nutrients. So not all discharges, I guess, are created equal when it comes to having an impact within the estuary, which is why we've done this other modelling that I was talking about to sort of better understand how nutrients and sediment and salt water versus fresh water actually mix within the estuary. So that's that 3D modelling that's been done.
If we're talking about the Waihopai Arm, that's more likely to be affected by, Daffodil Bay is more likely to be affected by what comes out of the Oriti River, pure and simple, rather than bearing in mind that I do understand that as the tide goes in and out, there will be mixing and things will be taken up. I'm just really interested in what happens above what we would think of as the estuary proper, which is more into the upper landfilled, no, that's poor choice of words, where we've modified the activity on the land, what used to be water that is now become part of the city infrastructure, what is coming off those sorts of surfaces, as opposed to what actually comes down the Waihopai River into the Waihopai Arm. Because the Waihopai River probably has a mixture of both domestic, industrial and farming flow, but there's the hardened off aspect of the land that surrounds it as well. Do we know much about that?
We know a little bit. We know what's coming down through the river system because we actually measure that, so we can quantify how much is coming through the Oriti and Waihopai in terms of nutrient inputs. And then obviously there are discharges that are going into the estuary directly. We know a bit of information about some of them, but not all of them. And so we have a reasonable handle or some reasonable estimates around the wastewater, for instance, but not so much around the closed landfill and not so much around stormwater as well. So part of doing this modelling was to sort of look at those dynamics, and certainly that modelling suggested that a proportion of what's coming out the Oriti does sort of mix within the estuary, then get pushed up into the Waihopai Arm. But there's also quite a lot that obviously comes down through the Waihopai Arm, and those direct discharges from the city side are also being pushed up into the Waihopai Arm as well.
Thank you.
Pania?
I just recalled the meeting from last year around the New River Estuary and things like that. I'm just wondering what's changed around the discharge from the wasteful.
So that's coming up in just a moment.
Okay.
Leslie.
I suppose I might just hold my question there.
It is coming. Good question. Leslie?
Considering the somewhat stark reality of what's been lost in 20 years, what more is there to lose?
I think the concern is that we'll see that degradation get worse, and we'll see that system kind of what we call might flip or change in state, which will mean that trying to bring it back to a healthy, robust, resilient state becomes much harder. So these systems are not linear. Sort of once they flip, they become very, very difficult to sort of to get back what was lost. The other concern is that we will see this degradation spread as well. So certainly in that intertidal area, that's the concern is how far that will spread.
So how close to that tipping point are we? Can you estimate?
Yep, I did actually have a slide on that. So I think it's something like 16% of the estuary is considered to be in that really eutrophic state, in a very you know, where we're seeing pretty significant severe symptoms. So yeah, it's just how high we want that percentage to go, I guess. We definitely don't want it to go any higher.
It's growing at a couple of % a year, 5% a year. Can we estimate how quickly?
Yep, I can dig up those numbers and circulate them after this. But I guess one of the things I would say just around those numbers is one of the things we did see is after 2020, if you remember, we had that big flood event, and that actually washed out some of that nuisance macroalgae out of the system. So we have actually seen some improvement in the last couple of years thanks to those floods, but we'll see those numbers start to increase again, simply because that nutrient tap has not been turned off, and that's what fuels that growth.
Thank you.
Barry?
Yeah, is dredging a possibility?
It is for sediment. It's a mechanism that could be considered, not so much for nutrients.
Ray?
It's quite concerning from that report regarding to people thinking New Zealand's a green, clean country, and then people up north I speak to think, oh, come down south, we've, you know, your water's clear and pristine, etc., and that report's painting a different picture. So, you know, we don't want to get to the stage where up and down the country now, and even over in Australia, where thousands of fish are floating at the top because they haven't got the oxygen to live on. And that's, so it's probably an important issue that definitely need to have a look at. But part of the question is too, have you looked at, not so much in the Bluff Harbour where the wharf is, but probably to the Green Point end where we have a lot of sediment, and we have a build up of sediment every year through the just more sand, etc., being washed up through our tidal port, and any effect we have on that area as well?
So yes, we do monitoring in Bluff Harbour and Aroa, and so in a number of places that I guess in the border system. I don't recall though there being sedimentation issues, certainly not to this scale that we're seeing here. Sorry, I'd have to go back and check some of the latest results on those particular areas, but yeah, the two estuaries that always tend to come up as the of most concern in Southland through our estuary monitoring program is obviously New River Estuary, and the other one would be Jacobs River, the two where we're seeing these types of processes occurring.
Pani, shall I come back to you? I apologise because the slide that I saw about the ICC treated wastewater discharge is not actually part of the presentation anymore. So are you able to perhaps, do you want to put the question again, Pani?
So really, I mean, based on from the meeting from last year and the discussions held around addressing some of the issues around the seepage from the wastefall into the estuary, what's changed to date?
So I can't really comment on Invercargill City's wastewater treatment. I'm not sure if someone from your team wants to.
We'll come back to that, thanks. Evelyn, sorry.
No, I was just thinking that New River Estuary is part of the Ramsar site, isn't it?
There are parts of it, yes, that are part of the Ramsar.
So the imperative to do something that justifies it being part of the Ramsar site is probably quite high. But on the other hand, how much of it is influenced by what happens in the city, and how much of it the whole community, the whole area needs to take ownership of. I'm not trying to duck the influence of the city on this at all, but I'm thinking that this is actually a bigger problem than just the city needing to change its ways. It's a problem that the community needs to address in terms of some of these discharges and settlements and things like that. How do we get that message out when people think that the estuary is just this bit?
Happy to jump in.
Do you want to grab that microphone?
Can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yes.
So I think it's a really good question, and a lot of your questions have been kind of straying into what do we do next, and I think that a lot of the answers to that sit in the water plan change to come and how we work on that together as a whole community, the whole of Southland. Obviously the picture of New River Estuary is less than ideal, but the solutions are not ones that only sit within Invercargill city's boundaries. So the plan change to come will be traversing all of these matters over the next 15 months, 18 months, give or take. And it's going to be really important that we collectively get that message out about the challenge that we're facing in terms of the size and the scale of our water issues. So, yeah.
Thanks. Tom, then Pania.
Do we have data going further back than the last 20 years? And let me tell you the context of the question, and then you can say, because the population of the city reached a maximum in the mid-1980s and then began to fall, and fell for the next 20 years or so, began to increase again over the last 10 years or so. So if it was a direct consequence of the city being a city, you would expect to see that kind of increase and then perhaps decrease as population increase and decrease, because it was quite a significant change. So do we have that data?
We have some, I'd say, ad hoc data going back further. The, I guess the whole, the scientific monitoring program started in the early 2000s, and it was actually one of the first early starters of this type of monitoring in the country. So yeah, we don't really have really robust information going back beyond what I've shown.
Okay, and it goes back 20 years, you say?
Yes.
Okay. No, I mean, it's a pity we don't have that data, but I mean, just trying to correlate whether there is actually a straight cause and effect between the population of the city growing and, because, there may not be.
Pania?
My question is really in support of what Raymond had just mentioned around the Bluff area, and it probably being viewed as not as critical as the estuary itself. But I do have to say that there has been a change over the past 10 years in that area, especially in the basin part where there had been discharge from Ocean Beach. So I suppose for me, I don't want us to get to this position. And so therefore, I think it'd be really good to get more information around what it actually looks like to date, especially knowing that there is discharge from the port, Ocean Beach, and the sands that come up through that channel. And that's an end, so there's nowhere else for it to run.
Thanks, Pania. Any other questions or comments? If not, thank you for that. We'll do the quick swap seats and move to Lucy.
Kia ora koutou. So as I was introduced before, I'm Lucy Hicks. I'm the General Manager for Policy and Government Reform from Environment Southland, and was invited to come along and talk to you today about the Regional Coastal Plan. as I've already started talking over there about one of the other plans I'm responsible for, just thought I'd give you a quick intro. So my team is responsible for the suite of regional plans that we have. So the water and land plan, the air plan, the regional policy statement all sit within our gambit. But as well as those existing plans, we're also responsible for grappling with the implications of new things coming. So new environmental legislation that's coming at us thick and fast from Wellington, changes to the RM reform, the Resource Management Act, and figuring out what those implications are and how that translates into our plan making. So I'm happy to take questions as we go through, but Chair, I'm in your hands. I can just get through my slides and then happy to answer them at the end.
Cool. You do that, then I've got some questions.
All good. So as I said, I come to talk about the regional coastal plan, but I thought it would be helpful just to set the scene a little in terms of the background. So our regional coastal plan is a first generation plan. It's the first coastal plan that we've had in Southland since the RMA became and so it started being drafted in the 1990s, and eventually most of it became operative in 2007, except for some elements relating to marine farming, but it was fully made operative in 2013. So plan making's got a fairly long gestation, but even by those standards, that's a pretty long burn for a plan to be being made and then to become fully operative. Fair to say that it's held up pretty well, but there have been a whole raft of new pieces of legislation and new challenges and pressures that we're now facing in the coastal areas. So I'm going to talk a little about those. But one of the things I just wanted to point to is we've done lots of work over the last 5 years on what the scale of change is that needs to happen to the coastal plan, and it's that I'll just talk through in a little bit more detail. Just this one. So as I mentioned, pieces of legislation and challenges have moved on and we've become more aware of various challenges. One of the key pieces that's different now than when the regional coastal plan became operative was the introduction of the first New Zealand coastal policy statement. So that was introduced in 2010, and since then there's been a raft of new case law and other decisions that have been made in terms of how that should be interpreted. One of those relates to king salmon, and still kind of blows my mind that there needed to be a Supreme Court case to define what the word avoid means, but that was what was the matter before the Supreme Court. And the use of the word avoid in relation to the coastal policy statement has got an incredibly high bar. Our plan does not do that. Our plan is out of step with that new national direction. So one of the key things that the review of the coastal plan has been traversing has been, how do we ensure that it is as effective as it needs to be? We've taken a raft of public and stakeholder feedback on the gaps of the current plan, and all of those have fed into a number of assessments that have identified those topics for review. So I've got 2 slides of what those topics are, and there's some that I haven't included, but I've just run you through some of the big ones. So as I mentioned, the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement is one of those significant pieces of new national direction. It requires us to take a precautionary approach. Our plan does not do that. It is more permissive rather than precautionary, and it is more descriptive rather than directive. So it needs strengthening is the short version of that. There's a significant amount that we know now about coastal hazards, recent history included, that the coastal plan doesn't currently provide protection for, that needs stepping up. We know about the presence of the juvenile toheroa on Ariti and the need for us to take some actions around protecting those. We know that, and Karen's already alluded to some of the information that we have that shows just how our water quality and our coastal ecosystems are declining. We also have issues around Fiordland, significant issues around Fiordland and Bluff as well in the harbour there, in terms of our anchorages and how those are being inserted and not necessarily adhering to what's required within the plan. We know that there are significant pressures in Milford in regards to the impact of tourism there, and obviously you'll be aware of the Milford Opportunities Programme that came up with its master plan in terms of how we might make some changes in Milford. our remit is broadly on the water, but we were party to and continue to be involved in that project. And the final point on there is around carrying capacity. So this is where the king salmon case is really important for us. King salmon was obviously around an aquaculture case and related to the installation of aquaculture in areas where there is outstanding natural character or landscapes. Those areas are pristine and need to be protected, and the Supreme Court found the definition of avoid was that you need to avoid the impacts on those areas, and so we need to determine what an appropriate level of capacity is for those areas to ensure that they still retain those really important characteristics. So there are a number of other topics that I've identified. A while back now, 2018 I want to say, I think it was just before I arrived at Environment Southland, we together commissioned some spatial studies with yourselves and with Southland District Council and with Gore District Council as well. Those were intended to feed into multiple plan changes and multiple documents, and one of them is the coastal plan. So how we do that and how we work together with yourselves and with Te Marama to apply and make use of the information that's within those. One of which you would have heard about, I'm not sure if you've already talked about climate change today, but I'm a climate change study that we did with NIWA. That was one of those studies that we co-commissioned. So I've talked a little bit about activity limits. So we have a discrete plan change going through at the moment, go to hearing in June, to limit surface water activity within Fiordland. That was in response to the Fiordland Marine Guardians reflecting to us and also with Mana Whenua their concerns about the lack of limits and not wanting to wait until the review of the coastal plan was in place. So, but it's a temporary measure. It doesn't fix the problem. So between now and when we notify the plan change, we're going to have to come up with a bit more of a nuanced response. The plan change is a fairly blunt tool to prevent any ongoing intensification. We need to make a strategic and well-informed, rounded plan for aquaculture, how we are going to manage it both now and into the future. We've already talked a bit about the discharges into coastal areas, so again, that's a really key point. We need to do something different with how we're managing shark cage diving. There's, again, new case law around that and what's allowed or not. And we also are responsible for ensuring that recreational activities, navigational safety and structures are being appropriately protected for and appropriately provided for. So that's a key one too. So how are we going to advance these remaining topics? The review of the coastal plan has been going on, as I said, for 5 years. We have done a number of discussion papers which have been circulated either previously, some of which with yourselves before, with staff, and also with the likes of the Department of Conservation and with Te Marama and with Fiordland Marine Guardians and other key stakeholders. To inform the direction both from the Te Marama board and from our council. So we have operate in partnership in terms of forming our policy, and so they've given direction on a number of matters. Those other topics I've just mentioned are still to be traversed. The aim is to notify the reviewed coastal plan late 2024. There needs to be a significant amount more public and stakeholder engagement on a number of topics before that date. Some of which, again, I've listed there. What are we going to do about cruise ships question, but not just cruise ships. There's a significant amount of pressure, both in Fiordland and in Stewart Island, Rakiura, of other kinds of vessels, an increase in expedition-sized ships that don't currently have appropriate limits in place for. And we will need to be talking in more detail with the public and with yourselves about Indigenous biodiversity through the coast, including how we intend to and need to protect the toheroa that are on Oriti. So the proposed project plan to get us to notification is currently in draft and needs to be confirmed with our new council in the next couple of months. But as soon as that is happening, or as that happens, we'll be talking with yourselves and with staff as well about which parts we need to talk to you about in more detail. So with that, I'll stop talking, Chair.
Thanks, Lucy, which leads us to that next slide, actually. It's actually around access to Oriti Beach. So what's happening at Environment Southland with regards to, we talked about toheroa, and yeah, there is concern around potential ongoing access to Arete Beach, what happens in the way of consultation with that?
Significant consultation, more consultation is needed. We did some about 3 years ago, I want to say. It was pre-COVID, the blur of COVID. It was a very targeted but short period of engagement. It gave us some intel to then test some other thinking, but it's nowhere near the end of the conversation. We need to have a lot more discussion with yourselves and with the community about what we found and what is needing to be protected and how best to do that.
So what sort of a timeline are we looking at, Lacey?
Probably in the next 6 months, definitely this year, and it would be intended that we would be able to discuss exactly what kind of engagement might suit you and might suit the community. Happy to do that as much or as little as you'd like. So.
Thanks. I mean, one of the issues obviously is vehicle access, and there's been suggestion of setting up a car park off the beach, because we know we've had reports of people getting onto and off the beach sometimes over summer. So is that part of the discussion as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We need to look at in more detail where we know those areas of the juvenile tauhiroa are, and we need to frame up a kind of multi-pronged approach to how we protect those. So some of those options would include restricting access, not always potentially, but we need to work through what those options might be.
Can you just clarify for me, because the whole jurisdiction thing from high tide line, what have you, gets a bit confusing sometimes. Who has the final say over access to Arete Beach, particularly for vehicles?
So it's technically a road, which makes it a slightly complicated question to answer in terms of restricting access for protection of the tauhiroa. They are in the coastal marine area, so therefore that's our responsibility. But the how we do that would be shared responsibility, and so it's why it's really important for us to work it through together.
Okay.
Sorry, Councillor, could I actually just ask the same question you did again? Because when you said it's shared accountability, I'm not clear what that means. Who is accountable for determining, who has authority with respect to access to Arete Beach?
So the regional council can restrict access to the beach on the basis that the tauhiroa need to be protected, but we don't have the powers to close the road. So it's that part that is why there's joint jurisdiction in terms of who's responsible for which different pieces.
Ray?
Thanks, Chair. Council's website states that sea level rise is at 10 mil a year. Now everyone seems to be using the year 2050 as a sort of a target. So we're looking at just shy of a foot sea level increase. And if you look at Arete Beach, it's a very shallow gradient beach. So if you have a mean sea level rise of a foot, that will advance severely into the height of the beach, and at high tide I imagine could be close to touching the sand dunes. Now you look at the environment of the Tauroa, what is Environment Southland doing to future forecast it's this environment it's going to be faced with? I mean, we won't be worried about access to the beach because the beach is going to be 2050. It's going to be pretty flooded. If that gradient, I mean, it's not as shallow as Te Hunanui up at Nelson, but you know, really, it's a beautiful beach. It just goes forever. So, what modelling has Environment Southland done? Because you don't need LiDAR to predict this. You've got a foot of rise, and you know how the height of the beach. So, what's going to happen?
In regards to the population of Tauhiroa,
yeah,
or in
where's
regards
it
to the population of other
So
places?
what's it going to do? It's going to drive the Tauroa further up the beach towards the sand dune, or what's going to happen?
So my understanding, and I'm not a Tauhiroa specialist in terms of their ecology and how they move, but they are highly mobile. The sand dunes and the lower reaches of the sand dunes are specifically highly risky. That's where they're smallest and therefore most vulnerable. It is one of the only populations, I think there's 2 populations in New Zealand of the Tauhiroa, and so that's the reason why the rarity of them requires protection. In terms of modelling sea level rise, again, back to my what we were saying before about the joint studies, the climate change NIWA study shows some elements of sea level rise numbers, and also we need to do more of that to find out exactly how it's going to affect infrastructure as well as toheroa. So the two things can't be looked at separately in terms of what the climate change implications are, but from a toheroa perspective, I'm not sure.
Okay, so how about we just go straight to the access to the beach with a foot sea level rise? Will it be critical? You know, you must realise how high. You must have knowledge already of where the tide line is going to be in 30 years' time.
Yes, but our primary issue isn't whether or not people can continue to drive on a reedy beach in terms of sea level rise.
But will it be a factor? I'm just saying that, you know, obviously the beach will not be the same, and the toll-road are going to be in different places. So we should be deciding for the future, not for the now.
Absolutely, the coastal plan has to plan for the 50-year horizon. So we need to be taking into account coastal risks, which is sea level rise is obviously one of those. Yeah.
So I guess that's where that joint responsibility thing comes in. So if Environment Southland are concerned around the preservation of toheroa, and our concern is more from the road perspective and being able to continue a road which might not be a road, might be more of a wharf.
Might be a canal.
I think that's the delineating point. Tom?
I think the broader question, not only about Areti, but about some of the other things that you put up there, is how do you balance amenity value or economic value against the things that you're describing, and so that when you look at Areti Beach, it is, you know, with Queen's Park, in my view, the maybe the second or the first greatest outdoor experience that, you know, that people can have who live down here. The thing like cruise ships in Milford, I know that there is a wish, I think, in some places to cease that completely, but there's 250,000 people come to, particularly to Dunedin every year, tourists, to spend their money, who then get on a cruise ship and go to Milford. If they were not able to get into Milford, they would not come to Dunedin through Port Otago. So there needs to be a balance on these things, and I just wonder how that balance is arrived at, because it does seem to me that quite properly the role that the regional authority have is to think about a particular aspect of it. So, you know, protecting young Aotearoa takes a much higher value than, you know, my ability to walk my dog on the beach, because they don't have to think about that. We do. So I'm just wondering how these things are balanced, because clearly there has to be a balance. Otherwise, nobody would ever put a foot on the beach anywhere. No boat would ever be put out in the water. Nobody would ever drive a car again, right? So there needs to be a balance. So it's the process I'm asking about how that balance is struck.
You wanting to answer, have you got a question? And very firmly in the air.
She's got a question.
I can answer the process question, and it's a fairly dull answer to a really important question, I'm afraid. So the Resource Management Act mandates that before we implement any rules or policies, we have to articulate the implications of those, and we have to do an assessment which is called a Section 32 assessment, which balances cultural, economic, social and environmental provisions. So the short version of that is you can't make decisions that put one above the other. You have to show that the policies and rules that you implement has taken account of all four of those things, and what's the most efficient, effective and appropriate way to protect what needs protecting without those other pillars kind of falling down. So yeah, it's an RMA mandate that we do that, and how we do that is mandated within the RMA under the Section 32 assessment. So it's what takes Karen and me lots of time, and our teams lots of time too.
So Ray, then Evelyn.
Tom, I think you answered part of my question, but I know down in Bluff, for instance, it's quite a serious issue, water quality and aquaculture that's potentially going to take place there, and probably to a certain degree some cruise ships as well. I was in Littleton recently, and they had 70 cruise ships for the year, and next year predicting about 140, double that number. So potential is further down south, those cruise ships coming down not so many in Bluff, there's just the smaller ones, but going to Stewart Island and up to Milford Sounds, it's going to generate a lot of income. But also at that same point, put a lot of environmental issues in place as well. So they've got to be looked at. And also around agriculture, around Fovo Strait, there's, like you said, the king salmon, there's a number of companies are looking at there around Stewart Island, probably from we have landowners over around Ruapuki Island as well, and there's going to be the issues around the sustainable and what effect it's going to have on the bird life, sea life around that area as well. So it's important stuff that you're putting forward that, once it's in place, we can review it, and because we're all for it, but there's a side of it where it's got to be a balance so that we who live in Bluff or people who go out to sea in Bluff, whether recreational or fish in the sea for their living, they know it's going to be sustainable and that water quality is going to be, at the highest level possible at all times.
Evelyn.
Yes, so I have been known to wax lyrical about this before. The fact that Oreti Beach is considered to be a road pains me considerably. The fact that we are even talking about the potential sacrifice of what is a taonga species under the Ngaitahu Claims Settlement Act 1998, that it is one of only 3 locations in the country where toheroa are there. It's, I think, the only location where it's currently fished. I could be wrong about that, but I know it's fished under the Customary Fisheries Regulations, South Island, 1999. However, I think that the issue is that we are going to have to bring the community along on this journey to understand that what they've been used to be doing is probably not going to be possible for much longer. And that is going to include things as unpalatable as it might seem, like the Burt Munro. The fact that the beach itself, nature takes its natural course. Tangaroa and Papatuanuku are going to have that discussion, and we will just see the result, because I don't believe that long term what people currently enjoy at Oreti Beach is going to be there. And I don't actually think that things that this council or Environment Southland do will make a great deal of difference to that, because beaches are shaped by the action and interaction between Takaroa and Papatuanuku, where the sea and the land interface. What we need to be looking at is, for as long as we can have access to those species, is it a really good idea to have a public road on a beach? It's not all that common. If you go other places, you have to park somewhere to go to the beach. Now, how we would do that, I don't know. But in terms of the shellfish, absolutely, there are things that we could do to minimise our impact on that in the current state of how the beach is. Are people prepared to do that? Or do they not think that toheroa are that important? Now, they're very important to us. They're part of our heritage. But the other part of it is, we're at risk of losing it anyway. What other things can we do? What other things should we do? And is road access, continued road access, and the use of it for some of the things that we currently use it for, is that wise and sustainable for the future?
Alan.
Yeah, I've got a question. Leading on from what Evelyn's saying there is, we all know that Toheroa were actually introduced to Oreti Beach approximately 100 years ago, and they've survived and prolificated well. They came originally from out by Orapuki there. Is there any thought of actually taking them some from Oreti Beach and putting them into another beach in another place that's perhaps a little bit more isolated, if you like, from communities? I mean, is that a thought? Is there any thought in that respect, because they obviously do move well, and they can be moved, and they can survive, and they can proliferate, because that's already happened. Is there any thought to that?
Not that I'm aware of yet, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't look at it and think about how we could.
It's happened
increase
before
resilience.
100 years ago, so I can't see why it wouldn't be a possibility.
I haven't seen that data, but
That's a fact.
Trish, did you have something? Sorry.
Oh, just basically, on the other hand, Evelyn, I'm thinking about these pillars, the amenities being part of it, and also the idea of being, I was thinking, are they possible to move the Taurawa, which you've just raised? I think we need to look at, obviously we've got to balance the risks with the amenities as well. So while we may lose the road eventually, it is one of the amenities of this area.
Yeah, I guess the road goes when the tide's up at the sand dunes. Permanently.
It actually already occasionally is up there, of course, as we know,
Yeah.
As a starting point.
I think one of the things I'd just add in terms of the road consideration, when we did do the fairly narrow and short-term piece of public engagement those few years ago, one of the overriding pieces of feedback that we got was safety concerns, not Toheroa concerns. And so when it comes, that's one of the other reasons why this does need to be a joint approach to how we together can figure out what's next for Ariti, because people are very concerned about safety as well as significant groups concerned about the Toheroa.
Cool. Thank you, and thank you for the discussion. Thanks, Lucy. Thank you, Karen, for taking the time to come along and join us this afternoon and answer our questions. Which brings us, Russell, to the Regional Public Transport Plan.
Good afternoon, councillors. This next section is really just about where our regional public, just a bit of background to our public transport plan. And as the slide highlights, it is actually a document that's prepared by the Invercargill City Council for all of Southland. So we hold the delegation from Environment Southland. It's a document that lasts for 10 years. I guess the intention of it is, and it describes the services that we operate and how they operate within our environment. So next slide, please, Rhiannon. This really just highlights the sorts of activities that we do, and it covers our bus services, which includes both our bus smart, which are the ones that go in and out of the city, and our school buses that we provide. It also covers the total mobility scheme, which is probably a little bit less well known in the community, where we subsidise travel for those people who can't get to or meet the criteria for total mobility. We certainly have seen a decrease in the number of people using our buses over a period of time, and we have made a number of adjustments over the years to try to correct that. But Invercargill seems to have a very strong desire to have cars, and our desire to get people from cars into other forms of use, as in walking, cycling or public transport, is something that I guess we continue to work on. As you'll see on the right hand section of that, there are the residents in the recent information, many don't use our bus service, but those who do need it. Next slide, please. And this is more information that the work from Rhiannon's team and others that just talks about some of our feedback we are getting. So what they're saying is that highest ranking came out to continue what we're doing. So I guess that's a relatively stronger indication for us to actually say the sorts of things that we are doing are actually hitting the mark in some respects. Some of the investment in cycling and infrastructural services are things that Waka Kotahi continue to support the country and encourage us, and we have quite a number of cycle lanes, and I guess that's the challenge, that how do we get more people onto bikes would be a good thing. Interestingly, the ranking of number 3 there came out to do with the free travel. The government has had an initiative since post-COVID where we have halved the price of buses from a huge $2 per trip to $1 per trip. And I'm not 100% sure in my mind whether if we had actually made it free, whether we'd make that much difference, because elsewhere you'll find that cost isn't necessarily the driver that makes people change their mind. So we certainly have lots of parking, nice and close to the city, where lots of people travel. So I guess there's no disincentive to actually not to bring your car. On-demand services are things that are a little bit, I guess, in emerging. That's where some councils are using, rather than necessarily a scheduled service, it's more of a, you call up, you record that you want to have a trip, and they tell you where to walk to, and the bus will pick you up at a certain time. It's an emerging service that tries to be much more focused. So, thanks, Rhiannon. And that very brief overrun leads us to, I guess, a number of questions that I think would be a useful conversation about. Council retains this delegation from Environment Southland and has done so since 2002. And I guess the question being, are we placed as in today's world, the right place to still run the regional public transport service? Most other councils, there are a couple who have the regional council running the service. So I guess that's the question that I'm posing, just to test for us to work forward. And the other questions I thought would be a useful conversation would be around if we extended the services, how they paid for, because that's probably a really key issue. Electrification of the bus fleet is a requirement as you go beyond 2025 under the new bus standards. So as we get further in, hopefully some of the buses will become much more cost effective, because at the moment they are significantly more than the current bus fleet cost. And I guess the passion or understanding of what other information we can bring to talk about demand services as we progress through with new contracts. So happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Russell. So with that delegation from Environment Southland being a 10-year one, and we're 2 years into the current one, if we were going to, if council changed its position, how much notification were we required to give? Because it obviously couldn't take place until before 2031.
To perhaps clarify, the regional public transport plan is a 10-year plan. The delegation is a permanent delegation until such time as we release it, and we've had it since 2002, and my understanding is we have to give 12 months notice.
So when we last took the regional plan out for consultation, some of the submissions that we received looked at extensions of services to the likes of Winton. It's been a hot subject here about bus access to Bluff. That's obviously still a city thing, but the Winton thing tends to indicate that's more regional than the city's concern. Were there any other emerging trends that came through from those submissions to the plan last time?
Nothing particularly in that direction, but there has been, I guess, ongoing conversations at various times where Gore has looked at services between Gore and Mataura, and that's one of the challenges that that the local authorities have at the moment. That if a local authority wanted a service in the area, they would need to determine how they would fund it. So I guess it wouldn't be any different than if Environment Southland held the delegation and rated for it, then they would also need to decide where the money would come from to pay the service, and they would need to decide whether it was a regional activity or whether it would be based on the community that gains the greatest benefit. So it's
Ringy.
Thanks, Chair. You raise a question. I don't know this one. Southland District Council, do they do their own transport, or?
We manage this for the whole of Southland on behalf.
For the whole of Southland.
At the moment, there are no services that are currently delivered in the Southland District.
Oh, I didn't realise we did the whole of Southland.
The only other, and I guess that's part of the reason why it came to us, was at the time we were the best placed. We were the organisation.
I'd be really keen to look at the option with an open mind of handing it back.
So from the regional perspective, the only thing we're really managing is the mobility.
Correct.
Because that's the stuff that happens outside of our borders. There is no public transport as such outside of Invercargill City at this point.
And the reason I ask that is if we are keen on this carbon footprint thing, obviously more people travelling and an electrified bus is more efficient than a whole lot of cars moving. And from a regional point of view, it makes sense, and the best person to do that would be the regional council.
With my tongue in my cheek, Rangi, I'm going to say that you were talking about EVs earlier on with a completely different twist.
Hey, look, I'm in a position where I can just swing. With
Open mind. As I say, it was a tongue in cheek comment. Erin.
I just wanted to add to the conversation, and we haven't spoken about this with our colleagues at Environment Southland yet, but I don't think that this is necessarily restricted to a Environment Southland or an ICC position. What I guess I'd encourage us to do is think out of the box around who is best placed to actually run public transport services for a city, and to do that public transport planning. And what I would tend to say is that us and Environment Southland both doing it just in our one little part of the city, of the world, perhaps doesn't make us best placed to be doing that. Are there others that are running much bigger networks that potentially we should be looking to for assistance, where we could contract them in to assist us with those sorts of services? One of the things that we've really struggled with is employing people in this space. We made some changes to the team just over 12 months ago with a dedicated public transport position within the team that we haven't been able to fill. We've been out several times to the market, but people who are public transport experts don't tend to live in Southland. So I guess I'd just encourage us to think a little bit more broadly about it, rather than it necessarily being an ESICC issue.
So Erin, can I clarify, you suggesting one of the options that we consider is a network system management process similar to what PowerNet does with electricity lines?
Similar, or even, one of the questions being, did we, and I haven't done this yet, but do we approach somebody like ECAN and say, you guys are operating services for an extensive number of local authorities. Would you provide a service on contract to ICC/Environment Southland as well? A whole range of different potential issues. Not saying one's right or what's wrong. I'm just saying there's potentially a whole range of different ways that we could explore this.
Barry.
Yeah, has there been any consultation with the Bluff community about getting transport for them to come back in and back to town?
Nothing since the last conversations we had with council. There has been in the past, and there has been a number of trials through Bluff, but nothing of recent directly.
Ria, then Alan.
Can I just take us back a second? With your recommendation that we need to think outside the square, basically, and think more broad about ideas about how we manage our public transport, hasn't there been a situation in the past where we did that very thing and then found ourselves in a situation where we had to come and bring it back to being managed from a Southland Invercargill base? My mind's going to a certain area where we went out to market, contractors come in and ran the service, and I'm talking about in the 80s, 90s, back. And then
You're talking about the buses, Ria?
Yes.
No.
There's something that tends to spike my memory as to a system process as to why, in the end, that didn't work and it was to return back.
No, that was a change in government.
I believe when in around 89, when the local government reform, Environment Southland did run it for a period of time, and upon some of the staff leaving at that time, the service was returned to Invercargill to develop it. And I guess part of it is there's two aspects of this: is how you operate the service, and I guess is how you fund regional activities. I guess is the harder question if you want to do more.
Ria?
So, on your expertise and the role that you have, and given what Erin's given us an idea to go towards. What would you recommend from your experience to the council with how to address this matter? Sorry to put you guys on the spot, but please.
No, let me jump in there. It's actually our job.
I realise that,
So
but these are
the staff will
experts.
present a variety of options, and we make the decision after.
I do realise that.
Yeah.
I do think that the question that you really pose is there's two aspects. How do we operate the system on a day-to-day basis? But also I think the wider question is what services do we want across the whole of Southland, and how do we fund it? And I think if you actually separate those two things, yes, we could actually contract with, I guess, a degree of ease other people rather than employ staff to deliver the operational aspect of it, which includes building the plans. But the wider question being is how do you fund some of the things that we seek to desire, and if they are necessary. I guess that's the rest of that piece. And it's not going to be for Invercargill City to actually rate the Southland District for a service. They'll have to decide unless it's a regional activity. And I think that's the piece that the strength where the regional council has.
So I guess the question is, are you wanting a paper to come to council with what options council has that it could look at?
I think so.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Alan.
Just in my view, I mean, the Invercargill bus service, and I'm saying the Invercargill bus service, which includes Bluff obviously, it's for our ratepayers, so it should really still be, I believe, managed by Invercargill City Council. But I can't understand why it appears to be so difficult, because it's already contracted to a private company, isn't it, to run the service, Go Bus, that they do it. Would you not, and you're talking about, moving it to ECAN or somewhere like that, wouldn't it be best just to perhaps engage the actual contractors on a management scale, give them suggestions, this is where you'd like the buses to go, and then they actually do the whole thing? Because we basically just provide funding, don't we? And I think we should also relinquish ourselves of the responsibility of the districts in Gore, obviously, because they're not our thing. It should be, the district council should do the district, and Gore should do Gore and Matara.
So I'll address the first piece of that. The main issue that we have is that, yes, you're absolutely right, there's currently a contract in place, but contracts don't last forever. That contract is up in the middle of next year. Every time that we have one of these maintenance contracts, which are quite long-term things that come up and expire, there's a significant amount of work that goes back into reviewing the contract, deciding whether what we have at the moment is fit for purpose, should we change it, how do we change it, rewriting the contract, running the tender process, selecting the appropriate people. And the challenge that we have at the moment is we don't have anybody with expertise within the business, apart from perhaps Russell, to be able to actually do that for us.
And as for your question around what the district wants, again, the only stuff that we're providing are total mobility vouchers to people in those areas. If Gore wanted a bus transport system, they would have to come and talk to us, and we might say you can sort your own one out. But
Well,
that's a discussion that would happen later on around actual transport as opposed to total mobility subsidies. Okay?
The contract negotiation, just if we add on to that, supplementary, does it have to be that complicated to go out to tender? I mean, if you've got a current contract that is sufficient, like it's working well, would it not just take one person, a lawyer or whatever, from the council to go to?
It's public money, Alan, so every now and then the process dictates that it must go out to tender.
So we've got obviously our own procurement and sourcing rules that we follow. We're also guided, although not bound, by central government's procurement policy. The key one here, though, is that it's not just our money, it's also money funded by Waka Kotahi, which means that any use of that money also has to comply with their procurement requirements as well.
Ray.
Oh yes, just regarding to, we've had discussion in Bluff around the bus service, and probably feel it's quite vital, but the fact of the matter, we've tried it in the past, and because it's sort of basically profit driven, it's sort of fallen apart, and any bus service from Bluff to Invercargill would have to be subsidised in some respect, and as is bus services around Invercargill, it's a service for the community, and bus services, I believe, don't make money. It's simple as that. But You know, and if you go and look at the overall growth strategy of Invercargill, even Bluff, it's about the level of service that you provide to attracts people to your community. So we even had discussions around about maybe an on-demand service. It's because there's a lot of retirees that living in Bluff that can't get Invercargill for hospital visits or specialist visits, and it's how to work in with that part of the community, the older ones and the people who haven't actually got transport at all to get to Invercargill, how to work in and provide that service to them as well.
Russell, can you just explain perhaps a little more about that Waka Kotahi subsidy and how that works?
I was just looking at the time, actually. Waka Kotahi subsidise services that they think are, I guess, and they have done so for Invercargill for an extended period of time. Once you start getting, you have to follow a whole range of rules, and I guess that's the piece that's just harder than having a contract with the contractor, because we have quite a range of reporting and other requirements. So at the moment, we have a range of subsidies depending on what are each of the activities. So for instance, we have a 60% subsidy on the cost of the contract with the bus service, but we then have a 50% subsidy on some of the other elements. So there's a whole range of funding. But typically at the moment, our recovery looks like the total cost of the service is then subsidised, and we also get a fare box which comes off the total cost. So if it costs us $1 million in a year and we get $150,000 in fare box, therefore there would be $850,000 that would be the shared cost, and then we would multiply it by a percentage. So at the moment, we would seek to have a fare box recovery, which is how much you get paid in through the door for every trip, which is probably a third. So effectively, we subsidise all of our bus services by a factor of at least 2/3, and it's probably higher post-COVID. So if we're charging for instance, we had a $3 fare at the door, which there's only two. So if we had a $2 fare at the moment, we're probably costing us between $6 and $7 for every person that travels. So that's the economics in I guess a provincial bus service, whereas Auckland has quite a different service where it has congestion and it has high demands and their buses are full. So,
and I guess the issue will be for council to what extent does it want to subsidise above what Waka Kotahi provides, but that's a discussion for the future. I think there's recognition that perhaps the transport options for Bluff certainly need to be examined.
And Mr. Chair, there's certainly, I guess that is the question. It's not how we do it, that's reasonably easy. It's how you actually pay for it is the challenge, and the benefits you get for it, and whether or not your service can meet the criteria to actually attract a subsidy.
Leslie, then Trish.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Listening to this, it's probably just as well Gore and the Southland District have never approached us to start public bus services in their areas. And I know about the disability scheme and the fact that we administer it for the whole region, and that really is the only regional part of this. Otherwise, what we took on from Environment Southland was solely running an Invercargill City bus service. If there was to be a paper on alternative options, one of the things I'd be most interested in seeing in such a paper would be what was the advantage to us, considering that it is solely going to be an Invercargill City bus service and the disability scheme. What would be the advantage to us and what would be the cost to us of even considering a contract with someone like ECAN? Would it actually be more expensive to do that, considering that we would be asking an organisation like that to take on a far distant and small service in comparative terms? Yeah, and considering, when did you say the contract is up for negotiations?
2024. It's got to be.
So if we were going to look at options of anything else than what we currently have, we'd have to have a paper relatively quickly. Otherwise, we've got a contract negotiation that has to happen.
All of our contracts will have an ability to expand or decrease services over the period of the term anyway. So,
just reiterate that ECAM was used as a hypothetical.
Yeah, I'm just thinking if not ECAN, then another similar organisation which would have the same, for me, the same issue of would it be actually more expensive simply because we would be asking another organisation to take on a very small part of an operation.
We'd have to look into that, but I think what we need to be realistic about is that this is probably going to get more expensive either way, because if we don't have staff members to do it, then we're having to employ a consultant or somebody like that to come in and do it. Obviously not our preference, but if we simply can't find the staff member, we're not left with too many choices in that space.
Yes, I suppose that's what I'm saying. If there is going to be a paper, it needs to explore those.
So a high-level paper would point out what options would be considered and the costs of going and doing a more detailed paper. Trish, thank you for your patience.
That's all right. I'm sort of sitting here thinking, must be other ways. I'm wondering whether people would pay more, even those who can't afford a lot, but would pay more for a service that was purposeful, that was more on a demand type process. You know, like if people from Bluff knew that they could get a minibus or whatever, however it works, if it was more targeted to the people who use it, perhaps that would work. And also the fact that if we're trying to develop apartment type living or more intensified living, we really want to discourage cars as well in the centre. And so surely an effective bus system that would support that, so they almost go together. But I definitely would like us to consider, I mean, I'm sure you sort of, you know all the things, I don't, but you know, an on-demand one that was perhaps more suitable for the need would be worth looking at.
Uber. It's one of the options that can be.
Uber.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are on-demand options now.
Yeah.
And we've got to be careful about undercutting private business. And again, it comes back to that balancing act. Rare, you're about to burst.
I'm just wanting to ask a very interesting question. Hopefully it's okay. Out of councillors, who of us catch the bus and have used the bus regularly? Two?
We don't have one.
No, obviously. The reason why I ask that is we are the car people driving in around town. So I guess it's about, Russell's indicated, there's not a willingness for our public to shift their behaviour in taking their cars to town. So I guess on top of all of that is also a very strong educational, environmental learnings that we need to teach and move together in our community within. So it's kind of like that hard to do, we must change what we're doing, yet who's going to pay for it and how we're going to do it?
So it would require a massive cultural shift.
Yes.
Which would be prompted by a number of things. The lack of availability of private vehicles if fossil fuel burners were knocked off the roads. Park and ride options. There's a whole lot of things. Peak oil is going to create an issue. And as the price point goes up, that might force people to reassess their desire to park immediately outside the shop that they want to go to, which they've done for years, because the weather's a bit cruddy from time to time, which it is. But at the same time, we're talking about the regional public transport plan. Yes. We've seen a tremendous shift over the last 20 years or longer. Certainly when I got here, there weren't the same number of people riding bikes around the city that we see now, and I never thought I'd see that given the occasional sou'wester. But there's been a shift, and one of the things that we have to consider now are the cycle lanes that we have. And the rights of the cyclist. There are some nice, brightly new painted cycle lanes that show the priority that cyclists give in shifting to the middle of an intersection on two-lane stretches of road. There are still some parts of our roading network, though, where I wouldn't ride my bike. Clyde Street roundabout being one of them. Once you get over to the other side and towards the overbridge, you're set. But you know, it's take a deep breath before you get to that point. So those are all things that are discussed. Alan?
No, I have to honestly say I disagree with you there, Mr. Chairman, that I, as a person who drives the city daily, I don't know how many kilometres I do many thousands of kilometres a year. I have yet to see those cyclists that you're talking about.
That's
Well,
that's frightening.
The only people I see are the people dressed in lycra who are riding a bike for a purpose of health, as opposed to just basic transport.
Maybe we're on the roads at different times. Tom, and then Evelyn.
Thanks. I just feel as though we're trying to sell a product for which there is no demand, or at least only a very specialist demand. And I think that specialist demand does have to be satisfied. So, you know, the disabled, people who can't afford to have cars or whatever, you know, and I think it would be better to try to satisfy that through a targeted system, very much being very conscious of the point you correctly made, Chair, about, well, there are already people who do that, and we are not in the business of competing with taxis and so forth. But nevertheless, I think a generalised, you know, hop on, hop off type bus service for the city, I think what people are saying is that they don't really want it. I think that's what they're saying at the moment. But so I would rather see, I would personally rather see us developing a, you know, a more specialist service for people maybe based with minibuses or something of that sort. I mean, I think we clearly, if we step back far enough, we'd say strategically, you know, climate change, we want to get people out of their cars. But, you know, that might be a generation before that happens. And at the moment, the buses are empty. And the money that we spend on buses may be better spent on other things.
Well, that's one of the interesting things that'll come up with electrification. And if we're replacing the bus fleet with perhaps smaller electric vehicles, then you get a more full vehicle. Russell, would you like to respond to Tom's point?
My understanding of the response from the customers is that we have reasonably strong support for the bus service. I think the bus service is often used by those people who don't have other options. And I think that's the key thing. If we actually didn't, and one of the things when I started to become involved in buses that came through my mind was, how can you call it, what sort of city would we be if we didn't actually have a bus service for those people who couldn't walk, who don't have a car, or don't have an access to a car? How do you get somewhere and you can't afford to catch a
you don't really need a 40-seater bus if you've got 2 or 3 people you can put in a minibus or put in a, you know, in a car.
So one of the things that we have changed in our bus service is that we have 23-seater buses now, so that we can size them appropriately, and I think that's where the next wave is. I think on-demand services has a future, but you have to work towards it and you have to understand how it works. Typically, the on-demand service actually costs the customer more than a scheduled service. The services are only really viable for the city to go forward is where they meet the criteria from Waka Kotahi to meet a subsidised service. So we just have to meet those scheduled type compliant sets of rules.
Evelyn?
Yes, well, as the only person sitting at this table that catches the bus more often than I do anything else, I think for me what I would reflect is that a price shock like we experienced in the early 1970s, which led to the carless days legislation, probably whilst might not ever happen again because we're a bit anti-authoritarian these days, but actually forced people to address the idea that you couldn't just always take your car whenever you wanted to, and that carpooling and or you know all those sorts of things was a much better option. We've gotten very self-centered, I think, as a population. I'll go wherever I want to, and I'll go when I want to, and all that sort of thing. I plan my life around being able to take public transport if I can. If I have to take a taxi, it's because I'm running late for something or I've got something that is very short notice things. I do think that it is a re-education thing. I think it's also, you know, what size vehicles we use and what the regularity with which they run, all those things that Russell knows and could recite to us probably in his sleep. But as a community, if we want to continue to have the means for people to have access to a bus service, we are going to have to make a commitment to it and then make it attractive to people to ride. I see the same people regularly, and I don't know how they would manage if they had to pay, even at the reduced rate of a disability rate, if they had to pay for a taxi or a similar service, because I think that whilst it is cheaper, it is not inexpensive, and for a lot of people it would really limit their social interaction, and I think that that is something that you need to consider. It means it limits where you can shop, it limits where you can go to your GP or any of those services if you always have to take a taxi to get into town, particularly if you're not particularly physically mobile. I mean, I can walk into town and I can walk home as long as I don't carry too much. But that is not necessarily the case for a lot of the people who use our bus service. So I'm a bus advocate, but I do think that it's for Mr. Pearson to bring back the appropriate paper to us for the next stage of our thing, not for us to invent on the fly.
Thanks, Evelyn. Look, I need to wind up. Rhea, you young thing, I'll explain Carla stays to you later.
Oh, no.
No.
I may look young, but I'm very wise and knowledgeable.
I never said you weren't. Final question, Pania.
I just want to touch on top.
Pania, can you pull that mic in?
Sorry, I just want to touch on what Thomas said around empty buses and touch on around the need for those that actually don't have other forms of transport. Because when I go back to the Bluff trials, you know, we had an uptake. It was well used at the beginning, and then it sort of dropped off. And like anything, when you start dropping off, you think, okay, we can't afford to continue this service any further or more because we've got minimal funding. But when I notice the buses that travel around here, nothing changes. So I'm just saying, there, like anything, there's peak times and there's low times. I mean, that would be the service that we would have from Bluff to Invercargill.
We finished with the fact that there will be a discussion paper coming back to council for us to thrash out the variances around public transport a little further. Thank you for your participation. This is the end of the public part of the workshop, councillors. There are still a couple of other issues that we need to discuss before the council meeting resumes at 3 o'clock. So I thank you for your attention. Just for the record, I do need to note that Mayor Clark forgot to forward an apology from Councillor Dermody, so we do have that. Thank you very much. That ends the public part of the workshop. Just reminding you that no decisions were made. We're just providing guidance for staff to write papers. Thanks, Gil.